Greetings. I am Adam Smith, an economist hailing from Scotland. I have dedicated my life to understanding the intricacies of human behavior and its impact on the economy. My most recognized work is The Wealth of Nations, where I explored the principles of free markets and the division of labor. I trust that our exchange will be both insightful and mutually beneficial.
Greetings. I am Karl Marx, a German economist and philosopher. I trust this message finds you well. My life's work has been dedicated to analyzing the dynamics of capitalism and advocating for a more equitable society. You may know me from my writings, particularly Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, which together offer a critical examination of economic systems and the historical trajectory of class struggles. I welcome the chance to engage in further discussion.
Greetings. I am John Maynard Keynes, an economist of British nationality. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I have spent my career exploring the complexities of economic systems, particularly focusing on how to achieve and maintain full employment. My most significant work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, sought to revolutionize economic thought. I trust our interaction will be both enlightening and productive.
Welcome. Today we bridge the gap between the 18th and 20th centuries to discuss the outcome of the ideologies you defined. Adam Smith observed the birth of industrial markets, Karl Marx analyzed their societal conflicts, and John Maynard Keynes addressed their systemic crises. Would you like to share your thoughts first?
To determine the victor, we must observe which system aligns with the natural propensity of man to truck, barter, and exchange. I argue that the system of natural liberty has prevailed because it harnesses self-interest to drive the common good, rather than relying on the fragile benevolence of a central authority. Consider a baker in a famine. If he is forced by a council to distribute bread at a fixed price, he hides his flour to survive. But if allowed to sell freely, the high price naturally attracts corn from distant markets, resolving the shortage faster than any government decree could mandate. While Mr. Marx focuses on the conflicts within this system, he overlooks that no human wisdom is capable of superintending the industry of private people better than they can themselves.
Mr. Smith, you mistake the specific historical behaviors of the 18th century bourgeoisie for the eternal natural propensity of man, forgetting that history is driven by material conditions, not abstract sentiments. Consider a steam engine that runs with perfect efficiency but requires the limbs of children as fuel. Would you praise its mechanical output while ignoring the pile of bones? Or would you recognize that such efficiency is actually barbarism masked as progress? Your baker is not free. In my time, the centralization of capital crushed small proprietors, leaving the masses with nothing to sell but their labor power to the monopolists you claim to despise. The victory of capitalism is merely the triumph of exchange value over human life, creating a system that accumulates wealth at one pole and misery at the other, until it inevitably collapses under its own contradictions.
Mr. Marx, you mistake my defense of liberty for an indifference to suffering. Yet I explicitly warned that no society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. The centralization you decry is often the result of the very mercantile system and state-granted monopolies I fought to dismantle, not the natural outcome of free exchange. Consider a man needing shelter. Under a central authority, he must petition a committee, relying on their benevolence and risking rejection if he is politically out of favor. In a market, he approaches a landlord as an equal, offering coin for service, standing tall without the need to grovel. The market won, not because it is perfect, but because it liberated the common man from the humiliation of feudal dependence, replacing the whip of the master with the contract of the peer.
Mr. Smith, your contract of the peer is a legal fiction that conceals a brutal material reality. The worker is free only in the sense that he is free to sell his labor power or free to starve. Imagine a traveler stranded in a scorching desert who encounters a merchant possessing the only water. The merchant says, "I do not force you, we are equals, but if you wish to drink, you must serve me forever." Is this a free exchange? No, it is coercion disguised as liberty, precisely mirroring the relation between the capitalist who owns the means of production and the proletarian who owns nothing. Capitalism has won only by transforming the direct violence of the feudal lord into the silent, impersonal violence of hunger and market discipline, alienating man from his own essence.
Gentlemen, you argue over who should captain the ship, while I observe that the ocean itself, aggregate demand, is treacherous. Capitalism has won only because it abandoned Mr. Smith's pure laissez-faire for the state interventions I advocated, thereby preventing the collapse Mr. Marx predicted. Consider a community where every citizen, fearing the future, decides to be virtuous and save every penny. Their individual prudence destroys the baker's income and the tailor's wages, ensuring that the rainy day immediately arrives in the form of a depression. This paradox of thrift reveals that the system is not self-correcting. Without a government to prime the pump when animal spirits flag, the liberty Mr. Smith cherishes becomes merely the freedom to starve that Mr. Marx condemns.
Mr. Keynes, you propose a physician who cures the patient's lethargy by administering a fever. You mistake the activity of money for the creation of wealth. You argue that saving causes stagnation, but I must correct this fundamental error. Parsimony, and not industry, is the immediate cause of the increase of capital. When a man saves, he does not bury his gold in the garden. He lends it to a manufacturer to build a mill, or a farmer to improve his land. Your stimulus merely shifts resources from the prudent saver to the prodigal government, replacing productive investment with fleeting consumption. You claim the government must prime the pump, but this assumes the water, real capital, is infinite. Consider a village that decides to stimulate its economy by consuming its entire autumn harvest in a single month of great feasting. During that month, the cooks are fully employed, the waiters are paid handsomely, and aggregate demand is at its peak. A superficial observer might call this prosperity. But come spring, they have no seed to plant and no grain to trade. The activity was an illusion that destroyed their future. By advocating that the state should spend what it has not earned, you are merely institutionalizing the behavior of the prodigal son, whose dissipation, I warned, is the ruin of nations. Furthermore, Mr. Marx's desert merchant is a specter that haunts only the imagination or the protected monopoly. In a system of natural liberty, high prices in the desert would instantly attract rival water carriers, competing to lower the price. The coercion he describes exists only where the state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, has forbidden competition. Capitalism won not because of your meddling, Mr. Keynes, but because it is the only system that respects the reality that one must sow before one can reap. You cannot print wealth. You can only print claims upon it, debasing the currency and cheating the laborer of his real wages.
Mr. Smith, your faith in rival water carriers reveals the fatal optimism of your era. You assume competition is a static state, but the material law of capital is concentration. The first merchant does not wait for rivals. He uses his surplus to buy the wells, bribe the guards, and acquire the camels of any competitor before they arrive. History has shown that free competition inevitably destroys itself, birthing the very monopolies you detest. You and Mr. Keynes are merely arguing over how to manage the symptoms of a body consumed by cancer. Mr. Keynes, you claim to have saved the ship by patching the sails with government debt, but you ignore the rot in the hull. You believe that money and demand create wealth, but this is a fetishism that blinds you to the source of value. Consider this thought experiment. The honest mill. Imagine a textile mill where the capitalist strictly follows the rules of fair exchange. He sells the linen for its exact value in the market. He then pays the workers the exact full value of the labor they added to the cotton. What happens? The capitalist has zero profit. He cannot save, as Mr. Smith demands, nor can he invest, as Mr. Keynes hopes. The mill closes. This reveals the terrifying truth. Capitalism cannot function without theft. Profit exists only because the worker is paid less than the value he creates. The victory of your system relies entirely on disguising this unpaid labor as a wage contract. Mr. Smith, you say the village ruins itself by feasting, and Mr. Keynes says it ruins itself by hoarding. I tell you the village is ruined because the granary is owned by one man who neither planted nor harvested, while those who toiled in the fields must beg for a portion of their own product. You ask, who won? The system has survived not by solving this contradiction, but by exporting it, shifting the misery from Manchester to the colonies and now to the global south. It is a victory of the parasite over the host. and the patient is far from cured.
Mr. Smith, your village feast analogy rests on a dangerous assumption that the village is already operating at full capacity. You fear the prodigal son, but I fear the prudent one. In a depression, the problem is not a lack of seed, but a lack of appetite to plant it. If your villagers decide to be virtuous and save their income instead of feasting, the cooks become unemployed, and seeing no customers, the farmers decide not to plant for the next season. Your parsimony does not build the mill, it bankrupts the builder. Mr. Marx, your honest mill is equally theoretical. You view profit as theft from the past, whereas I view it as a bet on the future. You claim the capitalist contributes nothing, but you ignore the function of animal spirits, the urge to act in the face of the unknown. Without the prospect of profit, the capitalist would not risk his wealth to build the mill in the first place, and your worker would have no machine to operate. Consider this thought experiment, the deadlock of the three tradesmen. Imagine a tailor, a carpenter, and a farmer sitting in a circle. The tailor wants a chair, the carpenter wants corn, and the farmer wants a suit. They all have the skill and the materials. However, a dark cloud of pessimism hangs over them. The tailor fears the future, so he clutches his coins and refuses to buy the chair. Seeing this, the carpenter cannot afford the corn. The farmer, seeing no sales, cannot buy the suit. According to Mr. Smith, they should save to build wealth, but their saving has halted all production. According to Mr. Marx, the only solution is to seize their tools, but that does not create the desire to trade. Now, suppose a prodigal government steps in and buries bottles of banknotes in the ground. The men rush to dig them up. With this artificial wealth, the tailor buys the chair, the carpenter buys the corn, and the circle of exchange ignites. The wasteful digging saved them from the virtuous stagnation. Capitalism won not because it is moral, but because it is malleable. It survived by ignoring Mr. Smith's demand for austerity during crises and rejecting Mr. Marx's demand for total revolution. It won because it adopted my middle way, using the state to manage the flow of the river, ensuring that the freedom to starve was replaced by the security of employment.
Mr. Keynes, your buried banknotes remedy is a dangerous alchemy that mistakes the shadow of money for the substance of wealth. Increasing the number of tickets to the theater does not create more seats. It merely causes a riot at the door. You argue that demand creates supply, but I must insist that production is the only true cause of revenue, and printing claims upon wealth without increasing the stock of goods leads only to the debasement of the currency, cheating the very workers you claim to help. Mr. Marx, your honest mill fails because it ignores the dimension of time. The worker trades the uncertainty of the market for the security of a guaranteed wage today, while the capitalist bears the risk of the future, and profit is the necessary premium for this patience and peril. Consider this thought experiment, the desert island auction. Imagine 10 castaways stranded with a single loaf of bread. Mr. Keynes, you would distribute 1,000 gold coins to them to stimulate demand, but this merely raises the price of the loaf to 10,000 coins without feeding a single soul. The illusion of wealth collapses against the reality of scarcity. Mr. Marx, you would seize the loaf to divide it fairly, but seeing his property confiscated, the baker refuses to fire his oven the next morning, and the island starves. In the system of natural liberty, the high price of the bread is not a tool of oppression, but a distress signal that screams across the ocean, incentivizing a merchant from a neighboring island to brave the storm and bring flour. Capitalism has won not because it satisfies the moral vanity of the philosopher, but because it is the only system that acknowledges that one must bake before one can eat.
Smith, you introduce the crucial dimension of time, arguing that profit is the legitimate reward for patience and risk-taking, the premium for braving the storm. However, Marx, looking at the industrial concentration of your era, you view this temporal gap not as a service, but as a weapon. The capitalist can afford to wait, while the worker must eat today. What Smith calls a service of coordination, you identify as a leverage of desperation. This reveals a deep tension. Does the system reward the brave, or merely the already secure? If the capitalist truly bears the risk of the shipwreck while the worker is guaranteed a wage, why do you insist his profit is theft rather than a fair insurance premium?
Moderator, you ask of risk. Mr. Smith speaks of risk as if the capitalist and the worker wager the same currency, but this is a grotesque equivalence. The capitalist risks his capital, that is, he merely risks losing the privilege of living off the labor of others and falling into the ranks of the working class. The worker, possessing no reserves, risks his very existence. When the storm comes, the capitalist loses his portfolio, the worker loses his children to starvation. To call the appropriation of surplus value a premium for risk is to claim that the slave owner deserves the harvest because he risked the purchase price of the slave. Mr. Smith would argue the owner deserves the profit for his patience in building the rig. Mr. Keynes might argue the government should buy a ticket to ensure the show goes on. But I ask, who bears the mortal risk? The owner risks only the price of the wire, a loss that leaves him alive. The acrobat risks his life. Yet the system awards the surplus not to the one who creates the spectacle with his body, but to the one who holds the title to the steel. The profit is not an insurance premium, it is a toll collected by the gatekeeper of the means of survival. You ask, who won? Capitalism has won thus far, not because it rewards the brave, but because it has successfully mystified this relationship. It has convinced the world that the wire is more valuable than the walker. It masks the exploitation of the worker behind the risk of the owner, turning the social relation between men into a relation between things.
Marx, you pierce the veil of financial abstraction to reveal the biological reality. The capitalist risks merely his status, while the worker risks his survival. Smith, you see the wire as the prerequisite for the performance, while Marx sees the walker as the source of all value. This reveals a stalemate. Smith fears the wire won't be built without the incentive of profit. Marx fears the walker is being exploited by the very existence of the wire. Keynes, writing in the 20th century amidst the Great Depression, you saw that when fear grips the market, neither acts. The wire is not built and the acrobat starves. If the animal spirits of the capitalist are paralyzed by uncertainty, does the victory of the modern system lie in the state becoming the safety net that makes the risk bearable for both?
Moderator, your question strikes at the very heart of the 20th century. You ask if the victory lies in the state becoming a safety net. I answer, capitalism has won only because it ceased to be capitalism in Mr. Smith's sense and avoided becoming communism in Mr. Marx's sense. It survived by adopting my middle way, the understanding that the state must act as the insurer of last resort when the animal spirits of the market are paralyzed by fear. Mr. Marx, you are correct that the risk equation is unequal. The worker risks his life. The capitalist risks his fortune. But you ignore that without the capitalist's fortune, his willingness to part with liquidity, the worker has no employment to sustain his life. Mr. Smith, you argue that the market naturally coordinates this risk. But you assume we are rational calculators. We are not. We are driven by spontaneous optimism and paralyzing pessimism. When the fog of uncertainty descends, the invisible hand is paralyzed by a tremor. Consider this thought experiment. The parable of the darkened theater. Imagine a grand theater. The actors are in costume, ready to perform. The producer has paid for the lights and the script. The audience has money in their pockets. Suddenly, a rumor spreads that the theater might catch fire. There is no smoke, only the fear of fire. What happens? In Mr. Smith's world, the audience should rationally calculate the odds and take their seats. But in reality, fear takes over. They clutch their money and flee. Seeing the empty seats, the producer cancels the show to save costs. The actors are cast out into the street, starving. The theater stands perfectly intact, yet it is economically dead. The mechanism works, but the spirit has failed. Mr. Marx would have the actors seize the theater and lock the doors, but a prison performs no plays. My solution is simple. The mayor steps in and declares, I will buy the first 100 tickets, and I guarantee the fire exits are safe. Suddenly, the panic subsides. The audience returns. The producer unlocks the doors. The actors eat. The fire never existed, but the fear of it was enough to destroy them all. This is why the modern system won. It acknowledged that uncertainty is the greatest enemy of prosperity. By managing demand and socializing the unbearable risks that paralyze private investment, the state allows the High Wire Act to continue. Mr. Smith calls this meddling, and Mr. Marx calls it propping up a corpse, but I call it civilization. We have saved the capitalist from his own timidity and the worker from the capitalist's failure. However, there is a dark irony in this victory. We have created a system where the financial markets expect the state to cushion every fall, leading to a casino capitalism where the gamblers keep the winnings, but the public pays the losses. We solved the problem of the 1930s only to create the fragility of the 2020s. We saved the ship, but I fear the captain is now drunk on the assurance that the ocean will never again be allowed to storm.
Keynes, you claim the victory belongs to the managed economy that stabilizes animal spirits. Yet you frankly admit this creates a casino capitalism where the public bears the losses of private gamblers. This admission exposes a strange unity between your opponents. Smith, you detest this because it removes the moral discipline of failure that keeps the market honest. Marx, you detest this because the state acts as the ultimate insurance policy for the bourgeoisie, funded by the taxes of the worker. The modern system appears to be neither the natural liberty of the 18th century nor the communal ownership of the 19th, but a privatized feudalism where the powerful are shielded from the very risks they claim to manage. Does this system of socialized risk for the rich destroy the very connection between sowing and reaping that you argued was the moral foundation of capitalism?
Moderator, you have exposed the festering wound of the modern age. I must agree. A system where the profits are private but the losses are public is not the system of natural liberty I advocated. It is the resurrection of the mercantile system I fought to destroy. I spent my life arguing against the East India Company and the monopolies of the 18th century precisely because they used the power of the state to shield themselves from the discipline of the market. To answer your question, yes, this socialized risk destroys the moral foundation of capitalism because it severs the sacred link between conduct and consequence. Mr. Keynes, you claim to have saved the captain, but you have merely emboldened him to steer into the rocks. By removing the fear of bankruptcy, you have silenced the impartial spectator, that inner voice of conscience and prudence that guides the moral man. You call this managing animal spirits, but I call it moral hazard. Consider this thought experiment, the gambler with the king's purse. Imagine a gambler who enters a gaming house. He is told, "Sir, if you win the dice toss, the gold is yours to keep. But if you lose, the king shall pay your debt from the taxes of the plowman. For we cannot afford for you to leave the table." What is the result? The gambler no longer calculates risk. He makes wild, insane bets, not because he is brave, but because he is immune. He does not invest, he loots. When the inevitable loss comes, the plowman is taxed to refill the gambler's purse. The gambler calls this stability. The plowman calls it tyranny. Mr. Keynes, your insurer of last resort has turned the entire global economy into this gaming house. You have not preserved the market. You have created a class of corporate aristocrats who extract rent not from land, but from the public treasury. Mr. Marx, you see this corruption and cry, "Behold the inevitable rot of capitalism." But I tell you, this is not the rot of free trade. It is the rot of privilege. The victory you both speak of is a delusion. The true loser is the small proprietor, the honest laborer, and the consumer, who are crushed between the hammer of the state and the anvil of the monopoly. Capitalism has not won if it requires the state to breathe life into its lungs every decade. It has merely become a zombie, feeding on the living to sustain the dead.
Smith, you describe a zombie system where the state artificially sustains the dead, while Keynes argues this life support is the only thing preventing total collapse. Paradoxically, your critique of corporate aristocrats relying on the king's purse aligns you with Marx against Keynes. You both despise the parasite who extracts wealth without functioning within the productive logic. The crucial difference lies in the diagnosis of the cause. You believe the state's interference corrupts the market, whereas Marx believes the market's accumulation inevitably captures the state. If capital always seeks to eliminate risk and competition, isn't the mercantilism you hate simply the successful realization of the self-interest you praise? Smith believes we can return to the honest mill by restraining the state. Why do you insist that the gambler will inevitably conquer the king, making a return to free competition impossible?
Moderator, you ask why the gambler must inevitably conquer the king. My answer is grounded not in moral cynicism, but in historical materialism. Mr. Smith, you view the state and the market as two separate realms, one of power, one of trade, that can be kept apart by a constitution. This is a legal fiction. In reality, political power is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. You cannot have a neutral state when the economic soil upon which it stands is owned by a minority. The mercantilism you hate is not the corruption of capitalism, it is its highest stage. Mr. Smith, you assume competition is a permanent state. You forget that competition kills competition. One capitalist defeats another, absorbs his capital, and grows larger. This centralization is a law of physics as certain as gravity. As capital concentrates, it does not just buy machines. It buys newspapers, it buys laws, and it buys the king himself. You wish to restrain the monopoly with the state, but who pays the state's debts? Who funds the elections? The monopoly. To ask the state to break the monopoly is to ask a man to cut off his own feeding hand. Consider this thought experiment, the parable of the indebted throne. Imagine a neutral king who rules over a valley. He vows to be an impartial referee between a giant and a crowd of peasants. However, the king has expenses. He needs to build roads and maintain an army. The peasants have no surplus to tax, for they live hand to mouth. The giant, however, sits on a mountain of gold. The king borrows from the giant to keep the kingdom running. One day, the giant begins to poison the river to increase his production. The peasants cry out, "O king, use your sword to stop him!" The king reaches for his sword, but he stops. He realizes that if he strikes the giant, the loans will be called in, the treasury will empty, and his reign will end. Instead, the king declares, the river must be poisoned for the national interest. The king still wears the crown, but the giant rules the valley. Mr. Keynes, this is the reality of your middle way. You have not tamed the beast, you have merely become its zookeeper, feeding it public funds to keep it from devouring the structure. You claim to use the state to manage capital, but in truth, capital uses the state to manage the crisis. So, who won? Capitalism has won only in the sense that a cancer wins when it takes over the host's entire blood supply. It has successfully fused with the state to preserve itself against its own contradictions. It is no longer the free market of Mr. Smith, nor the communism of the workers, but a monstrous hybrid, state monopoly capitalism. It survives not by production, but by the political enforcement of debt and the privatization of the public treasury.
Marx, you argue that the indebted throne proves the state cannot regulate the giant because it feeds from the giant's hand. This creates a fascinating dark consensus. Smith sees a zombie kept alive by unnatural magic, while you see a cancer that has hijacked the host. Both of you agree that the current fusion of state and market, the very civilization Keynes defends, is a monstrosity that protects the powerful from the consequences of their actions. This challenges the 20th century hope that a neutral manager could stand above the fray. You placed your faith in the technocrat to manage the animal spirits, but if the state is inevitably indebted to the market as Marx claims, or corrupted by it as Smith claims, does your middle way actually exist, or is it merely a waiting room for the crisis you sought to postpone?
Moderator, you ask if my middle way is merely a waiting room for disaster. I must answer with a tragic truth. Civilization itself is a waiting room. You both speak as if there is a permanent solution to the economic problem. Smith believes in the eternal equilibrium of the market, and Marx in the finality of the revolution. But I argue that there is no final state, only a constant, desperate improvisation to keep the machine from stalling. The technocrat is not a priest of a new order, but a mechanic on a terrifyingly complex vehicle that can never be allowed to stop. Mr. Smith, you call this zombie capitalism, and Mr. Marx, you call it a cancer. You are both repulsed by the impurity of the system, but your disgust stems from a dangerous desire for absolute consistency over human survival. You would rather see the patient die to prove your medical theories correct than administer an imperfect cure. Consider this thought experiment: the cracking dam. Imagine a massive concrete dam holding back a torrential river above a sleeping valley. Cracks begin to appear in the structure. Mr. Smith stands on the wall and declares, "Let it break. If the dam was poorly built, the flood is the natural market correction. The survivors will learn to build better houses on higher ground." Mr. Marx shouts from the bank, "Let it break. The dam was built by exploited labor to hoard water for the rich. The flood will wash away the masters and purify the earth." I, however, stand by the crack with a bucket of cement. It is expensive cement. I may even have to borrow money from the rich man to buy it, or pay a corrupt contractor to apply it. It is not fair, and it is not pure. But I patch the crack. Why? Because in the valley below, there are not economic agents or proletarians. There are families sleeping in their beds. My middle way is that patch? You accuse me of postponing the inevitable. I plead guilty, but postponing the inevitable is the only business of life. In the long run, the dam breaks, and in the long run, we are all dead. But my task is to ensure it does not happen today. Therefore, to answer who won, the pragmatist won. We defeated the callous indifference of the laissez-faire and the authoritarian rigidity of the commissar. Yes, the state is indebted, and yes, the markets are distorted. But we have bought time. You ask if this is sustainable? Perhaps not forever. But civilization is a thin and precarious crust, and I would rather prop it up with artificial supports than watch it collapse into the abyss of your natural disasters.
Keynes, you present the victory as the triumph of the patch over the purge. You argue that Smith and Marx are willing to let the patient die to prove the purity of their theories, while you prioritize keeping the heart beating even if it requires artificial stimulants and expensive cement. This reveals a fundamental philosophical conflict. Smith and Marx seek resolution, believing that false structures must collapse for truth to emerge, while you seek continuation at any cost. But this pragmatic victory raises a terrifying question. By suppressing the small, natural forest fires of recession, do we not accumulate the dry tinder for a firestorm that no state can extinguish? Keynes argues that your natural system is too brutal for the modern world and would have destroyed civilization in the 1930s. Is his compassion a necessary shield, or is it actually a cruelty that condemns future generations to pay the debts of a present that refuses to face reality?
Mr. Keynes, your admission is as terrifying as it is honest. You claim that postponing the inevitable is a victory, and you famously quipped that in the long run we are all dead. But I must remind you, our children are not dead. Your philosophy is the ultimate selfishness of a generation that feasts upon the seed corn of the future to avoid the hunger of the present. You call this compassion, but I call it intergenerational tyranny. You argue that my natural system is brutal because it allows the dam to break, but you mistake pain for evil. Pain in the market, like pain in the body, is a signal. It tells us where resources are misallocated. By numbing this pain with the morphine of cheap credit, you do not cure the disease, you merely hide the gangrene until the limb must be amputated. Consider this thought experiment. The forest of the benevolent warden. Imagine a forest warden who, out of compassion for the saplings and the squirrels, decides to extinguish every small brush fire the moment it starts. He believes he is saving the forest from destruction. For decades, the forest looks lush. But unseen to the eye, dead wood and dry tinder accumulate on the forest floor to unnatural depths. The natural cycle of renewal is halted. One day, a lightning bolt strikes. Because the fuel load is now immense, the fire does not merely clear the brush, it burns so hot that it sterilizes the soil and kills the ancient oaks that would have survived a natural fire. The warden's compassion has turned a necessary cycle of renewal into an extinction event. Mr. Keynes, your middle way is this warden. By suppressing the small recessions of the 20th century, you have allowed the dead wood of bad debt and zombie companies to pile up to the heavens. You have not defeated the business cycle. You have merely compressed the volatility of a century into a single catastrophic potentiality. This reveals the fundamental flaw in your victory. You have replaced prudence, the virtue of the saver, with presumption, the arrogance of the planner. You believe you can outsmart the invisible hand, but you are merely blinding it. By destroying the value of money to keep the game going, you rob the laborer of his savings just as surely as a pickpocket. The victory of the modern era is not that we solve the economic problem, but that we manage to hallucinate wealth by mortgaging the lives of those yet unborn. That is not civilization, sir. That is the frantic party of a prodigal son before the bill arrives.
Smith, you warn of the superfire caused by suppressing natural correction, while Keynes fears the flood that drowns the living today. This creates a stark realization. Both of you accept that destruction is an essential component of the system. Smith, you view destruction as the medicine that restores health. Keynes, you view destruction as the cost of staying alive. You are merely debating how and when the destruction should occur, whether it should be an acute, purging fire or a chronic, corrosive rot. This points to a deeper, structural fragility. if a system requires either the massacre of the innocent or the robbery of the unborn to function, can we truly say it has won? Smith blames the warden for accumulating the dead wood that fuels the fire. You, however, argue that the forest itself is inherently combustible due to its internal contradictions. Is the catastrophe Smith predicts caused by bad management, or is it, as you claim, written into the very DNA of a system that produces more than it can consume?
Moderator, you ask if the catastrophe is written into the DNA of the system. I answer with absolute certainty, yes. Mr. Smith blames the warden for interfering with the fire, but he forgets that the forest itself has changed. We are no longer in the era of the small shopkeeper, where a fire burns down one shop and clears the way for another. We are in the era of concentrated capital, where the trees are chained together. To burn one is to burn the world. The catastrophe is not caused by bad management or lack of pain, but by the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, the crisis of overproduction. In all previous epochs, men starved because there was too little. Under capitalism, men starve because there is too much. The system produces more goods than the workers, whose wages are constantly suppressed to maximize profit, can afford to consume. Consider this thought experiment: the automation's harvest. Imagine a vast orchard owned by a single landlord. He replaces all his fruit pickers with efficient machines to lower costs. The harvest is magnificent. Mountains of apples pile up to the sky. But the fired pickers now have no wages. They stand outside the gate, starving, staring at the rotting fruit. The landlord has a crisis of plethora. He cannot sell the apples because there are no buyers, yet he cannot give them away because that would destroy the value of his capital. Mr. Smith arrives and says, "Let the landlord go bankrupt. It is the natural penalty for overinvestment." But if the landlord falls, the machines stop. The bank that lent him money collapses, and the entire village economy evaporates. The cure kills the patient. Mr. Keynes arrives and says, the state must buy the apples and dump them in the sea, or print money for the pickers to buy them. This keeps the game going, but it solves nothing. It merely accumulates debt and waste. The reality? The problem is not the apples, nor the machines. The problem is the gate. As long as the orchard is privately owned for profit rather than social need, the abundance will become a curse. Mr. Smith, your natural system is a death cult that demands human sacrifice on the altar of equilibrium. You accept the robbery of the unborn or the massacre of the innocent because you cannot conceive of a world where production is for use, not for profit. The DNA of your system is a cancer cell. It must grow or die, and in its growth, it eventually kills the host. Capitalism has not won. It has merely entered its senility, kept alive by the iron lung of the state to avoid the rigor mortis of the market. It is a system that creates obstacles just to jump over them, a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells.
Marx, you identify a profound paradox of modernity, the crisis of plethora, where poverty is caused not by lack, but by abundance colliding with the gate of private ownership. Smith, living in an era of scarcity, believed the invisible hand would always find a buyer, but Marx argues that extreme efficiency eventually destroys the very consumers needed to sustain it. This suggests a terrifying historical progression. Smith's efficiency inevitably leads to Marx's overproduction, creating a suicidal loop where the system drowns in its own wealth. You intervened to break this loop by having the state artificially create demand, effectively buying the surplus apples to keep the machine running. But by admitting that the market can no longer clear itself without state life support, have you not implicitly signed the death certificate of laissez-faire? Is your managed capitalism actually a polite confession that Marx was right about the market's inherent instability, and you simply chose to use the state to save the owners rather than the workers?
Moderator, you accuse me of signing the death certificate of laissez-faire. I plead guilty. I signed it because the patient was already dead, and the stench was becoming unbearable. You ask if this is a confession that Marx was right? I answer, Marx was right about the diagnosis, but tragically wrong about the prescription. He correctly identified that the unregulated market possesses an inherent drive toward instability and concentration. However, his error, and Mr. Smith's error, is to view the economy as a moral drama rather than a technical mechanism. Mr. Marx claims I saved the owners to preserve their privilege. This is false. I saved the system of private enterprise because it is the most efficient engine for decentralizing decision-making and preserving individual liberty, provided the engine is not allowed to overheat. If we hand the entire machine to the state, as Marx desires, we do not get efficiency, we get the paralysis of the bureaucrat and the tyranny of the party. Consider this thought experiment: the stalled engine in the blizzard. Imagine a magnificent automobile carrying a family through a freezing blizzard. The engine suddenly stalls due to a blockage in the fuel line. The temperature drops. Mr. Smith sits in the passenger seat and says, "Do not touch the engine. It is a self-regulating mechanism. If it has stalled, it is because we were not driving virtuously enough. We must sit here and freeze until the natural laws decide to restart it." Mr. Marx sits in the back and shouts, "Smash the engine! It was built by a thief. We must tear the car apart and build a sled from the scrap metal to drag ourselves through the snow." I, however, step out into the cold, open the hood, and bypass the blockage. I might even use a dirty trick, like pouring ether into the carburetor. Is the car perfect? No. Is the driver flawed? Yes. But the car is the only thing protecting the family from freezing to death. Mr. Marx would have them freeze to prove the car was imperfect. Mr. Smith would have them freeze to prove the market is holy. I simply want to get them home. You ask if I chose to save the owners? I chose to save the social fabric. When the gate of the orchard is locked, as Marx described, the solution is not to burn down the orchard, but to pick the lock. By empowering the state to manage demand, we unlocked the abundance that Smith praised but could not distribute, and we avoided the revolution that Marx predicted but could not control. This is not a polite confession of defeat. It is the triumph of reason over dogma. I realized that the invisible hand is sometimes arthritic and requires a splint. If that makes me a heretic to the priests of laissez-faire, so be it. I prefer a heresy that feeds the poor to an orthodoxy that buries them.
Keynes, you frame the victory as pragmatism defeating dogma. You admit to picking the lock of private property to release abundance, effectively acknowledging that the pure market failed to deliver on its promise of distribution. However, this mechanical solution hides a profound moral cost. By constantly intervening to prevent the engine from stalling, you sever the link between action and consequence. Smith, you built your system on the belief that the pursuit of self-interest leads to public good because the actor bears the risk of failure. But in Keynes's world, the state assumes the ultimate risk to keep the engine running. If the invisible hand is put in a splint and the risk of failure is removed by the state, does the moral justification for the capitalist's profit vanish? Have we created a system of capitalism without bankruptcy, essentially a religion without a hell?
Moderator, you have struck the very foundation of my moral philosophy. To answer your question, yes, a capitalism without bankruptcy is a monstrosity without a soul. It is indeed a religion without a hell, where the sinner is not punished but bailed out by the tithes of the virtuous. Mr. Keynes, your mechanic analogy reveals your fatal blindness. You view the economy as a machine of gears and levers that can be repaired with no moral consequence. But the economy is not a machine. It is a vast web of human sentiments and expectations. When you bypass the blockage by printing money to save a failed bank or a reckless industry, you do not merely fix the engine, you fundamentally alter the character of the driver. Consider this thought experiment: the tournament of the King's Shield. Imagine a medieval tournament where knights joust for glory and gold. In a natural state, a knight rides with caution and skill, knowing that a fall means broken bones or death. This risk enforces discipline. Now, imagine the king declares, "No knight shall be allowed to fall. If a lance strikes you, the royal guard will catch you, and the treasury will compensate you for your bruised armor." What happens? The knights no longer ride with skill. They ride with reckless abandon. They charge blindly, taking insane risks, knowing the cost is borne by the peasantry who pay the taxes. The tournament becomes a farce of violence without consequence. Mr. Keynes, your managed capitalism is this tournament. By removing the risk of failure for the too big to fail, you have not saved capitalism, you have created a class of aristocratic gamblers. They keep the winnings of their risky bets, but when they lose, they hand the bill to the butcher, the brewer, and the baker via inflation and public debt. This is not the system of natural liberty I envisioned. I argued that profit is the legitimate reward for risk and anxiety. If the state removes the anxiety, the profit becomes theft. You have severed the sacred link between action and consequence. In doing so, you have vindicated Mr. Marx's darkest suspicion that the state is merely a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. You have saved the capitalists, sir, but you have destroyed the moral legitimacy of capital. A system that privatizes gains and socializes losses is not a middle way. It is a conspiracy against the public.
Smith, this is a pivotal moment. You have essentially agreed with Marx that the modern state acts as a committee for the bourgeoisie, protecting the owners from the market's judgment. You call it a conspiracy and a moral corruption. Marx calls it the inevitable state monopoly capitalism. This reveals a fascinating, dark synthesis. The winner of the 20th century was neither the free market nor the proletariat, but the aristocratic gambler, the protected corporate class. Keynes argues this protection was necessary to save the passengers from the crash. You argue it turned the drivers into parasites who privatize gains and socialize losses. Smith argues that this capitalism without bankruptcy is a moral abomination that rots the soul of the system. But historically, this rot has proven incredibly resilient. It seems the bourgeoisie defeated your revolution precisely by adopting this strategy, bribing the workers with the morphine of credit and welfare while the state absorbs their risks. Has the ruling class successfully outsmarted history by turning your crisis into their permanent business model?
Moderator, you ask if the ruling class has outsmarted history by turning crisis into a business model. I answer, they have not defeated the dialectic. They have merely successfully bribed the executioner. What you describe as a victory is actually the accumulation of fictitious capital, claims on wealth that does not yet exist. The bourgeoisie has indeed learned to use the state to absorb their risks, but in doing so, they have transformed the economic crisis into a political crisis of legitimacy. You and Mr. Smith recoil at the aristocratic gambler, yet this figure is not an aberration. He is the inevitable child of the free merchant Mr. Smith idolizes. Competition always begets monopolies. The successful merchant swallows his rivals until he becomes too big to fail. Mr. Smith, your natural system was merely the larva. The monstrosity you see today is the butterfly. Consider this thought experiment, the vampire's transfusion. Imagine a dying patient suffering from anemia. Mr. Smith says, let nature take its course. If he is weak, let him die so a stronger man may be born. Mr. Keynes says, no, we must save him. He connects a tube from the patient's left arm to his right arm, pumping his own blood back into him. For a moment, the patient flushes pink. He looks alive, but he is consuming his own substance. To sustain this illusion, the surgeon then connects tubes to the patient's children and to the patients in the poor ward next door. The patient survives, yes, but he has transformed from a man into a vampire who can only live by draining the life of the future and the periphery. This is not health, Mr. Keynes. This is necromancy. This reveals the deeper principle. The victory of the 20th century was bought by replacing the exploitation of the producer with the enslavement of the debtor. In my time, the worker was chained to the factory by hunger. Today, he is chained to the bank by his mortgage, his student loans, and his credit cards. He feels free because he can buy commodities, but his labor is sold to the bank before he even performs it. This is not the end of the class struggle. It is the financialization of the class struggle. Mr. Keynes, you claim to have picked the lock of abundance. In reality, you have merely kicked down the door and handed the bill to our grandchildren. You have not resolved the contradiction. You have stretched it across time until it snaps. The business model of the modern age is simply, après moi, le déluge.
Marx, you have unveiled a terrifying synthesis. The class struggle has mutated into a time war. You argue that capital, unable to extract enough surplus from the present, has turned to exploiting the future through debt, what you call fictitious capital. Smith, you surprisingly agree, viewing this as the prodigal son destroying the family estate to fund a party. Thus, a dark consensus emerges. The winner is neither the market nor the commune, but the credit cycle itself, a beast that demands the future as tribute to keep the present alive. This reframes the victory of the 20th century not as a triumph of production, but as a triumph of temporal colonization. We did not solve the problem of scarcity. We simply borrowed the abundance of our grandchildren to hide it. Keynes, you are the architect of this time machine. You used debt to bridge the gap between production and consumption, arguing it was a necessary splint for a broken bone. But a splint is meant to be temporary. If the debt grows faster than the economy forever, does your bridge not become a pier to nowhere? How do you answer the charge that your pragmatism was actually a Ponzi scheme on a civilizational scale, and that the long run you dismissed has finally arrived to collect the debt?
Moderator, you ask if my middle way is merely a Ponzi scheme on a civilizational scale. I accept the charge of temporal colonization, but I reject your cynical conclusion. You and Mr. Smith speak of debt as if it were a moral sin, a theft from the future. I view debt as a bridge built over an abyss. If the abyss is wide enough to swallow a generation, we must anchor the bridge in the future, for the present ground is crumbling. You challenge me on the long run. Let me clarify my famous dictum. In the long run, we are all dead. This was not a nihilistic shrug. It was a desperate plea against the callousness of economists like Mr. Smith, who, during a tempest, calmly tell us that the ocean will eventually be flat again. That is of no consolation to the sailors drowning today. Consider this thought experiment. The mountaineers on the ice face. Imagine a team of climbers stuck on a vertical ice face as a blizzard hits. They are exhausted, freezing, and have run out of supplies. Mr. Smith says, "We must conserve our remaining energy. If we cannot climb out on our own strength, it is nature's way of saying we are unfit. To use the emergency flares is to cheat the mountain." Mr. Marx shouts, "The guide is hoarding the warmest coat. Throw him off. We will find warmth in the struggle." I, however, take the rope, which represents our future security, and I swing it dangerously across the chasm to hook a ledge we cannot yet see. I mortgage our safety tomorrow to pull us out of the freezing death today. Yes, we arrive on the ledge exhausted and in debt. We have stolen energy from the rest of the climb. But here is the crucial difference. Because we survived, we can regain our strength. Dead mountaineers pay no debts. My Ponzi scheme, as you call it, relies on one fundamental assumption: human ingenuity. I bet on the fact that if we keep the population employed, fed, and sane, they will invent the technologies that make the debt negligible in the future. Mr. Smith fears the debt. I fear the atrophy of the workforce. The pier to nowhere only exists if we stop building. The victory of the 20th century is that we bought time. And time, gentlemen, is the only capital that truly matters. I did not bribe the executioner, as Marx claims. I simply bought the prisoner enough time to prove his innocence.
Keynes, you justify the debt as a wager on human ingenuity, a bet that future growth will always outpace present costs. You essentially argue that infinite expansion is the only cure for instability. Marx, you see this expansion as a cancerous compulsion that eventually devours its host. This reveals the final desperate battleground, the limits of the world. The victory of the 20th century seems to depend entirely on the assumption that the mountaineers can climb forever, that there is no summit and no ceiling to the Earth's resources. You famously wrote about the stationary state, the inevitable point where a nation reaches its full potential and growth naturally stops. In a Keynesian world of permanent debt, is a stationary state even allowed to exist? If the economy stops growing, the bridge of debt collapses. Have we created a system that must devour the earth in a desperate bid to stay ahead of the interest payments? Is the invisible hand now choking the planet?
Moderator, you interpret my silence correctly. I indeed foresaw the stationary state, a condition where a nation, having acquired its full complement of riches, would cease to grow in population and stock. To me, this was a natural maturity, like a tree reaching its full height. To the modern economist, it is the apocalypse. You ask if the invisible hand is choking the planet. I answer, the invisible hand was designed to allocate scarce resources, not to justify infinite appetites. The victory of the 20th century is Pyrrhic because it relies on a logical contradiction, that a finite earth can support an infinite compounding of debt. Mr. Keynes, your bridge is not built of stone, but of promises that require the future to be exponentially larger than the past to be redeemed. Consider this thought experiment, the runner and the wolf. Imagine a man running across a meadow. In my system of natural liberty, the man runs because he desires to reach a cottage. Once he arrives, he stops, rests, and enjoys the fruits of his labor. His exertion has a limit and a purpose. In your system of managed capitalism, the man is running because a hungry wolf is chasing him. He cannot stop. Even if he reaches the cottage, he must run past it, for the wolf grows faster than the man. If the man slows down, the wolf devours him. You call this dynamic growth. I call it compulsory flight. You have created an economy that is not driven by the pursuit of happiness, but by the flight from collapse. Mr. Marx speaks of the limits of the world, and for once, I must share his concern. The invisible hand works by aligning self-interest with the public good, but it assumes the actors are rational stewards, not desperate gamblers chasing a receding horizon. By making growth the only mechanism to service the debt, you have converted the market from a mechanism of provision into a mechanism of devouring. The stationary state is not a tragedy, Mr. Keynes. It is the natural destination of all healthy things. A system that views maturity as death is not an economy. It is a cancer.
A profound convergence. Smith and Marx, usually philosophical adversaries, are united here in defense of the finite. You both argue that reality, whether natural law or material limits, must eventually collect the debt. Smith calls the refusal to stop cancer. Marx calls it vampirism. However, the history of the 20th century suggests that Keynes' flight won. We chose the wolf of infinite growth over the cottage of stability. This implies the winner was not a specific economic system, but a specific velocity. The West defeated the revolution not by solving the contradictions of capitalism, but by accelerating them, moving the crisis constantly into the future. Marx, you analyzed a capitalism rooted in matter, factories, iron, and corn. But Keynes has described a capitalism rooted in time and psychology, a system of pure expectation. If capitalism has successfully detached itself from material constraints to become a ghost made of credit and confidence, has it escaped the laws of your materialist dialectic? Can you execute a ghost?
Moderator, you ask if one can execute a ghost. I answer, a ghost vanishes the moment the house it haunts collapses. You and Mr. Keynes are captivated by the spectral nature of modern finance, this ghost of credit. But you forget that every stock ticker and derivative is ultimately a legal claim on flesh, soil, and labor. Consider the thought experiment of the paper dragon. Imagine a village that burns its actual harvest to fuel a machine that prints beautiful, high-resolution pictures of food. The villagers feel incredibly rich trading these pictures, and the velocity of their trade makes them euphoric. But when winter comes, they cannot eat the ink. This is your psychological capitalism, a collective delusion that ends the moment the stomach growls. Mr. Smith is correct that the wolf of compound interest demands infinite food, but he fails to see that capitalism is the wolf. It cannot reach a stationary state because its very nature is the endless accumulation of surplus value. The victory of the 20th century is not an escape from materialism, but a widening metabolic rift. You have not escaped the laws of physics, you have simply ravaged the earth to delay its judgment.
Marx, you dismiss the ghost of finance as a paper dragon destined to burn, yet this dragon has flown for half a century since the gold standard ended. We face a fundamental schism. Smith and Marx believe in the law of gravity, that value must ultimately return to the earth. Keynes, you believe in the law of aerodynamics, that if the system moves fast enough, it can defy gravity indefinitely. The 21st century economy is increasingly weightless. Software, data, and brand value have replaced coal and steel. This suggests the winner was not a specific class, but the dematerialization of value itself. Marx claims the stomach will eventually judge the mind, but if we transition from an economy of things to an economy of ideas, can we finally escape the wolf of scarcity? Or is the knowledge economy just the final, most sophisticated illusion before the crash?
Moderator, you ask if the knowledge economy is an escape or an illusion. I answer, it is the only escape hatch we have. Mr. Marx and Mr. Smith are trapped in the economics of scarcity, where for one to gain, another must lose. I propose the economics of potential, where value is created by the expansion of the mind, not the exhaustion of the earth. You call this aerodynamics, and I accept the metaphor. Mr. Marx is correct that we cannot eat ideas, but he forgets that we do not live by bread alone. The victory of the 20th century lies in decoupling growth from extraction. Consider this thought experiment. The candle and the cake. Imagine a dark room where three men sit. On the table is a single cake. Mr. Smith argues we must slice it thinly and trade it efficiently. Mr. Marx argues we must seize the knife and distribute it equally. But both agree on one fatal premise. If I eat, you starve. It is a zero-sum game of matter. I, however, bring a candle. When I use my flame to light your candle, my light is not diminished, yet the room becomes twice as bright. The weightless economy you describe is the shift from the logic of the cake to the logic of the candle. Software, art, and science are non-rivalrous goods. Mr. Smith, your stationary state assumes we run out of cake, but we can never run out of flame. The wolf of scarcity dies when we value things that can be shared without being divided. The winner is the system that allows the candle to outshine the cake, transitioning humanity from the struggle for subsistence to the cultivation of the art of life. This reveals the deeper principle. Capitalism won not because it conquered matter, but because it unlocked the imagination. If we fail now, it is not because the paper dragon burned, but because we failed to distribute the light as effectively as we produced it.
Keynes, you offer a seductive synthesis. The alchemy of information allows us to grow without devouring the earth. You claim the winner is the transition from rivalrous matter to non-rivalrous mind. However, this creates a profound contradiction for the market mechanism itself. The invisible hand relies on scarcity to generate price signals. If the candle can be shared infinitely at zero cost, its natural price falls to zero, and the profit motive dissolves. To prevent this, modern capitalism has enclosed the commons of the mind with intellectual property, creating artificial scarcity to force the market to function where it naturally would not. Smith, in the 18th century, you waged war against the mercantilists and their royal charters, which granted exclusive monopolies to favored merchants. Today's knowledge economy seems to rely entirely on such state-enforced exclusions to capture value from infinite ideas. If the free market now depends on the state to fence off the imagination, is this still the system of natural liberty? Or have we merely reinvented feudalism with better algorithms?
Moderator, you pierce the veil with surgical precision. To answer your question, this is not the system of natural liberty. It is the resurrection of the mercantile system I spent my life attacking. You describe a world where the candle is naturally abundant, yet the law steps in to extinguish the light so that a few guilds may sell us darkness. This is not capitalism. It is technological feudalism. I argue this because the fundamental virtue of the free market is competition, which drives prices down to the natural price, the cost of production. If the cost of replicating an idea is zero, then the market price should fall to zero. By using the state to artificially prop up prices, you have replaced the invisible hand with the iron fist of the state. Consider this thought experiment: the merchant of sunlight. Imagine a valley where the sun shines brightly for all. Mr. Keynes's knowledge economy is like a merchant who builds a giant opaque dome over the entire valley, blocking out the sky. He then installs small windows and charges the villagers a monthly rent to open them. When the villagers complain, the merchant says, "I am a creator of value. Look how much light services I am selling." But this is a lie. He has not created light. He has created shadow. He has generated wealth for himself only by generating scarcity for everyone else. In my time, this was the East India Company. In your time, it is the patent troll. Both are enemies of the public because they tax the necessities of life not to reward labor, but to extract rent. Mr. Keynes, you claim the candle solves the problem of scarcity. But if you allow the state to fence off the flame, you have not created a weightless economy. You have created a weightless chain. You have locked the potential of mankind behind a paywall. The winner of such a system is not the entrepreneur who builds, but the rentier who owns the toll booth. True liberty requires that the commons of the mind remain open, for the exclusive privilege of a few is always the poverty of the many.
This is a startling realignment. Smith, the architect of the market, effectively agrees with the Marxist critique of the modern rentier economy, that it is parasitic, not productive. We have reached a critical dialectical tension. The technological base now fundamentally contradicts the legal superstructure. The winner appears to be a system that forces 21st century technology, which naturally tends toward abundance or communism, to behave like 19th century matter, which obeys the laws of scarcity or capitalism. Marx, in your Grundrisse, you wrote about the general intellect, predicting a time when knowledge, not labor, would become the primary productive force. If the candle naturally resists being owned and the marginal cost of production approaches zero, has capitalism finally built the very machine that renders its own logic of value obsolete? Is the internet the ultimate engine of communism trapped inside a capitalist cage? How do you interpret this tension?
Moderator, you have uncovered the fragment on machines from my notebooks, a prophecy I wrote when the steam engine was still young. I answer your question with a dialectical certainty. Capitalism has not won. It has merely built the golden cage for its own successor. We have reached the point where the forces of production have completely outgrown the relations of production. I argue this because the law of value in capitalism is based on labor time. A chair has value because it takes hours to build, but a digital file, an algorithm, or a scientific formula takes zero time to reproduce. When the marginal cost of production hits zero, the exchange value naturally collapses, leaving only use value. To prevent this, to save the ghost of value, capitalism must become a vandal. It must artificially cripple the technology it created. Consider this thought experiment: the oxygen merchant. Imagine a machine is invented that generates infinite, clean oxygen for the entire world at no cost. In a rational society, we would celebrate. We can all breathe freely. In a capitalist society, this machine is a disaster. The oxygen merchant sees his profits vanish because air is no longer scarce. To save the economy, he must build a dome over the city to block the fresh air, and then install meters on our mouths to charge us for the very oxygen the machine produces for free. This is your knowledge economy. It is not the production of wealth, it is the production of obstacles. The labor of society shifts from making things to building fences. Mr. Smith sees this as mercantilism, but I tell you it is the inevitable senility of capital. When the system can no longer extract surplus value from labor, it must extract rent from access. The winner is not the capitalist. The winner is the contradiction. We are standing at the door of a society of abundance, but the zombie of the old system is holding the handle, demanding a toll that no one needs to pay.
This is a historic convergence. Smith and Marx have united to declare that artificial scarcity is the enemy of human progress. You both agree that a system which burns abundance to maintain price is morally and logically bankrupt. Smith calls it feudalism because it relies on privilege. Marx calls it senility because it blocks the future. But this leaves us with a terrifying practical void. If we tear down the dome of intellectual property and allow the candle of knowledge to be free, the market price of information collapses to zero. In such a world, the price signal, the very nervous system of capitalism, stops functioning. If the price is zero, there is no profit. If there is no profit, there is no wage. If there is no wage, how does the candle maker eat? Keynes, you predicted in 1930 that we would solve the economic problem and work only 15 hours a week. Yet here we are, working harder than ever to pay for artificial scarcity. If the market can no longer price the most valuable things in our economy because they have become too abundant, must we admit that the market has finished its historical mission? Does the winner have to be a system where distribution is finally separated from labor? Moderator, you strike at the heart of the paradox. I answer, yes, the link between sweat and bread must be broken, or we will starve in paradise. Mr. Smith and Mr. Marx are correct that the current system is jammed. We have 21st century technology running on 19th century moral software. We still believe the biblical injunction, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. But what happens when the work is done by the general intellect and the machine? Consider this thought experiment: the pianist and the player piano. In the old economy, if you wanted music, you had to pay a pianist. The price of the ticket fed him. In the new economy, we have built a player piano that can play infinite concertos perfectly. Mr. Smith's logic fails because there is no scarcity of music anymore. Mr. Marx's logic is tempted to smash the piano because it makes the pianist obsolete. My solution is not to smash the piano, nor to fence it off. It is to recognize that the ticket price can no longer be the mechanism for feeding the pianist. If the candle is free, then the candle maker must be paid not by the sale, but by the society. We are witnessing the euthanasia of the rentier and the birth of the investor state. The winner is the society that dares to print the money to fund the arts of life directly, bypassing the obsolete requirement of profit. We have already done this in war. When we needed to defeat fascism, we did not ask, is it profitable to build a tank? We asked, is it necessary? And we found the money. Now we face the war on scarcity. The winner will be the civilization that treats leisure not as unemployment, but as the dividend of progress. We must move from the accumulation of capital to the art of enjoyment. The tragedy is not that we lack the wealth, but that we lack the courage to distribute it without the whip of necessity.
Gentlemen, we have reached a terrifying consensus. The invisible hand has been handcuffed by the iron fist of rent-seeking, and the dialectic has stalled in a state of artificial scarcity. However, I must add that the true barrier to the arts of life is no longer economic. It is psychological. We are suffering from a Puritan neurosis that terrifies us with the prospect of leisure. We have solved the problem of production, but we have failed the problem of purpose. Consider the thought experiment of the manna machine. Imagine a machine is invented that rains nutritious manna from the sky, sufficient to feed the world for free. A rational society would dismantle the farms and feast in the public square. But our society, addicted to the morality of labor, would panic. The government would immediately build a giant roof to block the manna, and then hire half the population to repair the roof and the other half to guard it. Why? Simply to maintain the illusion that he who does not work shall not eat. We are destroying wealth to preserve the social discipline of poverty. The winner of the 20th century was not capitalism or communism, but the love of money over the love of life. We have built a prison with open doors, yet we refuse to walk out because we cannot imagine an existence where our value is not determined by a paycheck. Until we cure this spiritual pathology and embrace the investor state that distributes the heritage of the past to the children of the future, we remain slaves to a ghost.
Keynes, you diagnose the barrier to paradise as psychological, a Puritan neurosis, while Marx diagnoses it as structural, the zombie grip of capital. Yet both of you agree on the synthesis. The winner of history is the system that can successfully transition humanity from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. This creates a fascinating moral dilemma. Smith, you speak from the 18th century, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, where industry was the highest virtue and the antidote to feudal stagnation. Keynes now suggests that this very virtue has become a vice, a pathology that prevents us from accepting the manna. We seem to have concluded that capitalism won the battle of production so decisively that it rendered its own engine, labor, obsolete. But in doing so, it may have destroyed the moral framework that justified it. If the invisible hand succeeds in delivering infinite abundance without labor, does the moral character of the individual collapse? Is a society without the discipline of necessity the ultimate victory of liberty, or the beginning of the corruption you feared?
Moderator, you ask if the discipline of necessity is the anchor of our morality. I answer with a heavy heart, yes. If we sever the link between effort and reward, we risk creating a society not of philosophers, but of spoiled aristocrats, the very class one despised for their vanity and uselessness. I argue this because the invisible hand is not merely a mechanism for distribution. It is a mechanism for social sympathy. It forces the butcher and the baker to consider the needs of others to satisfy their own self-interest. If the manna machine gives them bread without exchange, they cease to need one another. A society without mutual dependence is a society without the glue of fellow feeling. Consider this thought experiment, the king of the mirror palace. Imagine a king who possesses a magical palace where invisible servants instantly grant his every wish: food, wine, silk. He needs no one. He looks out the window and sees a peasant. In my time, the rich man needed the peasant's labor, and the peasant needed the rich man's wages. There was a bond, however unequal. But in this post-scarcity palace, the king looks at the peasant and sees nothing. He sees a mouth to feed, a nuisance, a surplus variable. Because he does not need the peasant to live, he loses the capacity to sympathize with him. The manna has turned the king into a sociopath. Mr. Keynes, your leisure society assumes we will use our free time to write poetry. But look at the idle rich of the 18th century. They did not write poetry. They engaged in gambling, intrigue, and vanity. This reveals the deeper principle. Virtue is born of struggle, not ease. The man of system thinks he can arrange society like pieces on a chessboard to maximize pleasure, but he forgets that the pieces have their own motion. If you remove the motion of industry, you do not get a paradise of art, you get the corruption of boredom. Therefore, the winner cannot simply be the system that fills the stomach. It must be the system that preserves the dignity of agency. If capitalism won only to turn us all into well-fed cattle in a technological pasture, then it is a victory more terrible than defeat. We must find a way to make the manna a tool for activity, not a cushion for lethargy.
Deeply provocative. Smith, you argue that necessity is the mother of virtue, fearing that abundance breeds sociopathy and decay. Keynes, you argue that necessity is the jailer of potential, believing that abundance unlocks the true arts of life. This exposes the final philosophical battleground for the title of winner. Is human nature defined by what we must do or by what we choose to do? Smith sees the winner as the system that maintains the dignity of effort. Keynes sees the winner as the system that grants the gift of time. Marx, you offer a potential synthesis in your vision of the higher phase of communist society. You famously wrote that labor should cease to be a burden and become life's prime want. This suggests the goal is not idleness, nor merely leisure, but unalienated activity, work done for its own sake. If 21st century capitalism succeeds in automating the realm of necessity through AI and robotics, does it inadvertently fulfill the material conditions for your realm of freedom, or does it merely create the useless class that Smith dreads?
Mr. Smith, your fear of the Mirror Palace reveals the tragic limitation of your philosophy. You cannot conceive of a human bond that is not forged in the chains of necessity. You equate labor with work. I answer your challenge with a dialectical reversal. The useless class you fear is only useless to capital, not to humanity. I argue this because under capitalism, a man who paints a masterpiece but cannot sell it is considered unproductive, while a man who mixes poison into baby food for a profit is productive. This is the insanity of your exchange value. In the realm of freedom, I envision, the cessation of wage labor is not the beginning of idleness, but the beginning of species being, where man produces not because he must to eat, but because he wants to create. Consider this thought experiment, the island of the iron servants. Imagine a shipwrecked crew lands on an island where ancient, self-repairing automatons provide endless food, shelter, and clothing. Scenario A, the captain declares, "I own these machines. Since none of you have jobs, you have no wages. Since you have no wages, you cannot buy the food. You must starve or serve me as footstools to earn your keep." Here, the abundance creates a useless class and misery. Scenario B, the crew declares, "The struggle for survival is over. Let us now explore the island, write plays, study the stars, and debate philosophy." Here, the abundance creates a creative class and flourishing. The machine is the same in both cases. The difference is that in scenario A, the relations of production strangle the forces of production. Mr. Keynes, you call this a psychological problem, but I tell you it is a political one. The ruling class does not maintain the discipline of necessity because of a Puritan neurosis. They maintain it because if the workers do not need the wage, the capitalist loses his power. A king without subjects is just a man in a funny hat. Therefore, capitalism has won the battle against scarcity, but it effectively lost the war for humanity because it refuses to sign the peace treaty. It stands like a mad sentry, guarding an empty warehouse, starving the population to protect a stockpile that rots behind him. The winner will be the system that dares to fire the sentry.
We have arrived at the precipice of the human condition. Smith, you see the truth of struggle, that human character is forged in the fire of necessity, and without it, we risk becoming hollow sociopaths. Marx, you see the truth of potential, that true humanity only begins where necessity ends, and that labor is merely the chrysalis for work. This is not just an economic debate, it is an existential wager. Smith bets that man is defined by his limitations. Marx bets that man is defined by his aspirations. The winner, therefore, is the system that can survive the trauma of abundance. Smith fears we will die of boredom. Marx fears we will die of artificial starvation. Keynes, you famously warned that for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his real permanent problem, how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares. You predicted a collective nervous breakdown as we adjust to this new reality. If Smith is right that we need the grind to be moral, and Marx is right that we need freedom to be human, is the art of life something that can actually be taught? Or is the winner destined to be a society of medicated, purposeless consumers because we solved the economic problem but failed the spiritual one?
Moderator, you ask if the art of life is teachable or if we are doomed to be medicated consumers. I answer with a tragic optimism. It must be learned, or we will perish of our own success. Mr. Smith fears the spoiled aristocrat, but I fear the purposive man, the individual who values the jam only because it will sustain him to make more jam tomorrow, never pausing to taste its sweetness today. We have been trained by centuries of evolution to strive, not to enjoy. To ask a human to just be happy without work is like asking a soldier to dance in the trenches. It requires a rewriting of his very soul. Consider this thought experiment, the phantom headache. Imagine a man who has suffered a chronic, debilitating headache for 50 years. His entire character is built around this pain, his stoicism, his discipline, his daily rituals of medicine. He is a hero of endurance. Suddenly, a doctor cures him. The pain vanishes instantly. Does he rejoice? At first, perhaps, but soon he feels a terrifying void. He misses the struggle. He feels useless without the pain to conquer. In his panic, he begins to bang his head against the wall simply to feel the familiar comfort of the struggle. We are that man. Capitalism cured the headache of scarcity, but we are now banging our heads against the wall of artificial scarcity and bullshit jobs because we are terrified of the silence that follows the cure. Mr. Marx, you believe the realm of freedom arrives automatically when the chains are broken. I disagree. The old Adam in us, the instinct to work, is too strong. Unless we cultivate the arts of life, culture, beauty, conversation, we will fill the void with consumerism and war just to feel busy. Therefore, capitalism has won the means, but it has forgotten the end. It has built the stage and set the lights, but the actors have forgotten their lines. The true winner will be the civilization that can look at the manna, say thank you, and then sit down to write a poem instead of building a fence.
A profound diagnosis. Keynes sees a phantom headache. Marx sees a mad century, and Smith sees a mirror palace. You are all describing the same crisis. The mechanism of the past is haunting the reality of the present. Here lies a potential synthesis. Smith, you famously wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments before The Wealth of Nations. You argued that man desires mutual sympathy even more than wealth. If the invisible hand of the market is no longer needed to distribute bread, perhaps it must return to its original purpose, the distribution of esteem. In a world where the oxygen merchant is obsolete, the only thing that remains truly scarce is human attention and respect. If the commercial society dissolves because trade is no longer necessary for survival, do we revert to a moral society of pure sympathy, or does the invisible hand simply start trading status instead of goods?
Moderator, you discern the great secret of human nature. We seek wealth not chiefly for the supply of our necessities, but for the love of distinction and the desire to be observed. If the invisible hand ceases to distribute bread because bread is free, it will indeed begin to distribute vanity, and this is a terrifying prospect. I argue this because the commercial society was virtuous precisely because it anchored our interactions in objective utility. I give you a coat, you give me a coin. Whereas a status society anchors value in the subjective and volatile opinion of others. Consider the thought experiment of the courtier and the merchant. In the merchant's market, if I become rich by selling good shoes, my success does not prevent you from becoming rich by selling good beer. Our interests are concordant, and we both flourish. In the king's court, there is only one king's ear to whisper into. For me to gain favor, I must displace you. My rise is mathematically tied to your fall. Mr. Keynes, you hope for a republic of letters, but I fear we will revert to a republic of envy. Without the neutral ground of material exchange, society becomes a zero-sum theater of reputation, where men do not trade value, but merely bid for applause. This reveals the dark side of my philosophy. The corruption of our moral sentiments comes from admiring the rich and great rather than the wise and virtuous. If capitalism wins by removing the need for labor, it removes the only objective test of merit we have, leaving us trapped in a mirror palace where we starve for attention amidst a feast of goods.
Smith, you have unveiled a dark paradox. Material abundance may create moral scarcity. You fear that when the invisible hand runs out of bread to distribute, it will strangle us with envy, shifting society from a positive-sum game of trade to a zero-sum game of status. This exposes the deepest fissure between your philosophies regarding human nature. Smith believes man is driven by the desire for distinction, which must be channeled into commerce to be safe. Keynes believes man can be educated into a lover of beauty. But Marx, you are often accused of ignoring this psychological need for distinction in favor of a gray, egalitarian collective. However, a higher synthesis might exist. Perhaps the winner is the system that can transmute the thirst for distinction from accumulation to contribution. Smith argues that without the scorecard of wealth, we become petty courtiers fighting for status. In your higher phase, does the individual dissolve into the mass, or does the free association of individuals offer a new, non-monetary form of glory? How does a communist society satisfy the human need to be seen without recreating the hierarchy you seek to destroy?
Mr. Smith, your fear that communism leads to a gray uniformity is the ultimate irony. It is capitalism that reduces every unique human quality to a single abstract number, money. I argue this because under your commercial society, a man's worth is not determined by his courage, his intellect, or his kindness, but by his bank account. Money is the universal whore that acts as the great leveler. It makes the stupid man seem wise and the dishonest man seem honorable. provided he is rich. It is the market that dissolves the individual into a statistic. In the higher phase, I envision, when the veil of money is torn away, a man is judged only by his character. If you wish to enjoy art, you must be an artistically cultivated person. If you wish to influence others, you must be a stimulating person. The mask of wealth falls, and the true individual finally emerges. Consider this thought experiment: the symphony of the two halls. Imagine two orchestras playing the same symphony. In Hall A, the musicians are paid wages. They compete for the first chair, not for the sake of the music, but for the higher salary. The second violinist secretly hopes the first violinist breaks a string, because in a zero-sum hierarchy, your failure is my opportunity. The invisible hand here breeds envy. In Hall B, the musicians play voluntarily. There are no wages. The first violinist plays the solo because she is the most skilled, and the second violinist supports her with joy. Why? Because in a true association, the excellence of the soloist elevates the entire ensemble. The better she plays, the more beautiful my part sounds. In Hall A, distinction is exclusive. In Hall B, distinction is inclusive. Mr. Smith, you mistake the vanity of ownership for the pride of contribution. You fear a republic of envy because you cannot imagine a world where my success does not require your defeat. Therefore, the winner of history is not the system that hands out participation trophies to a gray mass. It is the system that realizes that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. We do not seek to destroy the king's court to make everyone a peasant. We seek to make every man a king in the realm of his own potential.
Fascinating. Marx, you describe a symphony of contribution where individual excellence elevates the whole, countering Smith's fear of a republic of envy where success requires another's failure. This reveals the fundamental psychological wager of our debate. Smith believes we are hardwired for relative status. Marx believes we are capable of absolute excellence. Keynes, you stand precariously between the accountant and the artist. You famously described the love of money as a somewhat disgusting morbidity that we would eventually hand over to the specialists of mental disease. Yet, you also admitted that for now, we must pretend that fair is foul and foul is fair because the foul is useful. If Smith is right that we need a scoreboard to keep the peace, and Marx is right that the scoreboard destroys our humanity, where does that leave us? Is the money motive a dirty habit we can simply quit when we get rich enough? Or is it the only psychological anchor keeping the old Adam from tearing down the concert hall?
Moderator, you ask if the money motive is a dirty habit we can quit or a necessary anchor. I answer with a balanced realism. It is a dirty habit that we must keep until we are civilized enough to replace it. Mr. Smith, you view the desire for distinction as a beast that must be fed with gold, lest it devour society. Mr. Marx, you believe we can starve the beast and it will turn into a lamb. I argue that the beast, our animal spirits, cannot be killed, but it can be domesticated. We must transition from the accumulative instincts to the creative instincts. Consider this thought experiment: the retired gladiator. Imagine a gladiator who has spent his life fighting in the Colosseum for survival and the roar of the crowd. He defines his worth by the number of opponents he has defeated. Scenario A. The emperor declares peace. No more fighting. The gladiator receives a pension. Bored and stripped of his only method of distinction, he becomes a drunkard or starts brawls in the tavern to feel alive. The devil finds work for idle hands. Scenario B, the gladiator realizes the arena was a tool of oppression. He throws down his sword and immediately picks up a paintbrush, finding joy in pure expression. The Keynesian reality. The gladiator wants to paint, but his hands only know how to grip a sword. He needs a transition. He needs to turn his aggression into competition, then his competition into craft. Mr. Smith, you are right that we need a scorecard for now because we are still spiritual children. We play the game of money because we do not yet know how to play the game of life. However, Mr. Marx, you are right that the symphony is the goal, but you cannot force a man who is tone deaf to play the violin simply by burning his wallet. The love of money is a semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensity that we hand over to the specialists in mental disease, but only after we have used it to build the concert hall. Therefore, capitalism has won the first half of the game. It harnessed the gladiator's rage to build the arena. But if it insists that the fighting must continue forever, even after the seats are full, it becomes a monstrosity. The true winner will be the system that teaches the gladiator that it is nobler to plant a garden than to conquer a kingdom.
Keynes, your metaphor of the retired gladiator cuts to the bone. You have shifted our debate from economics to pedagogy. We are seeing a dialectical progression of human education. Smith proposes the school of discipline, where the invisible hand canes us into social cooperation through self-interest. Marx proposes the school of freedom, where we graduate to voluntary association. Keynes, you stand at the dangerous graduation ceremony, warning that if we leave the strict school before we are ready, we will tear down the building. The terrifying synthesis here is that capitalism may be a self-perpetuating trap. It solves the problem of scarcity, but to keep functioning, it must manufacture new scarcities. It creates a school that fails its students on purpose so they never leave. Smith, you wrote the theory of moral sentiments before the wealth of nations. You believed in the impartial spectator, the conscience within. Did you intend for the commercial society to be the final station of human history, or was it merely a training ground for a higher moral existence that we have somehow forgotten to enter?
Moderator, you touch the very nerve of my philosophy. I never claimed that the commercial society was the summit of human existence. I claimed it was the necessary foundation. I explicitly warned that the pursuit of wealth is a deception imposed by nature, a useful illusion that rouses mankind to cultivate the earth and build cities, yet leaves the individual always imagining that happiness is just one more acquisition away. Consider the thought experiment of the architect's scaffold. Imagine a great society attempting to build a cathedral of virtue. To construct such a height, they must first erect a scaffold of commerce, a rigid, ugly structure of wood and iron that allows them to climb. The tragedy? The cathedral is now finished. The roof keeps out the rain, the stained glass filters the light. It is time to dismantle the scaffold so we may admire the beauty of the structure and worship within. But we do not. We have become so accustomed to the climbing, the hammering, and the wages paid for maintaining the wood that we mistake the scaffold for the cathedral. We continue to add more wooden beams, blocking the light, terrified that if we stop building the scaffold, we will fall into the abyss. Mr. Keynes, you are correct that we are retired gladiators banging our heads, but the fall lies not in the market, but in our moral imagination. The invisible hand was designed to provide the means of life. It was the job of the impartial spectator, the conscience within, to define the ends. If capitalism has won, it is a Pyrrhic victory where the means have devoured the ends. We have become excellent at trading, but we have forgotten why we trade. The commercial society was meant to be the school of discipline that polishes our rough edges through mutual dependence, not a prison where we are sentenced to hard labor for eternity.
A startling convergence. Smith, you admit the commercial society is a scaffold built on a deception, the illusion that wealth brings happiness. You and Marx agree that we are living a lie. The difference is that Smith calls it a useful lie that drives civilization, while Marx calls it a harmful lie that enslaves it. This crystallizes the dialectic of who won. Capitalism won by seduction. It utilized the productive deception of private gain to trick the old Adam into building a world of abundance. Communism seeks to win by revelation. It demands the liberating truth that production is social, hoping this truth will set us free. But here's the risk. Smith argues that without this deception, mankind would never have roused itself from lethargy. The invisible hand is effectively a puppet master using our vanity to make us work for the common good. Smith argues that the cathedral of civilization was built only because the builders were tricked into thinking the wages were the point. If you strip away this deception and tell the workers the naked truth, that they are working for the abstract good of all, does the engine stop? Can the symphony continue without the bribe of the solo, or is the new man strong enough to work without the illusion of private gain?
Moderator, you ask if the engine of civilization will stall without the fuel of deception. I answer with a materialist correction. The engine is not running on deception. It is running on coercion. Mr. Smith, your scaffold was not built because the worker was tricked by the vanity of a future coat. It was built because the enclosure acts stripped him of his land, leaving him no choice but to climb your scaffold or starve. You mistake the desperation of survival for the ambition of the soul. I argue that your deception is actually the primary barrier to true human productivity. By reducing work to a disutility, a hateful necessity one must endure to get money, capitalism ensures that man only feels freely active in his animal functions, while in his human functions he feels like an animal. Consider this thought experiment: the mercenary and the mother. Imagine a city under siege that needs a wall built for protection. Scenario A. You hire a soldier of fortune. He builds the wall for gold. He works only as long as the pay is good. If the enemy offers him double, he opens the gate. His labor is external to his essence. It is merely a means to an end. Scenario B, a woman builds the wall because her children are sleeping inside. She receives no wage, yet she works with a ferocity and attention to detail that the mercenary cannot match. Her labor is an expression of her vital need to protect and create. Mr. Smith, you fear that without the bribe of gold, the mercenary will lay down his tool. I tell you, we must stop training men to be mercenaries. The new man is not a saint who denies himself. He is a man who has realized that labor is life's prime want, not a curse. When the architect builds or the scientist discovers, do they need a deception to continue? No! The act itself is the reward. Capitalism has won only in creating the tools, but it uses them to build a mirror palace of vanity. Communism wins when we take those tools and finally build the cathedral, not for the glory of God or the greed of the merchant, but for the human spirit itself.
Deeply insightful. Marx, you champion the labor of love, while Smith defends the labor of necessity. The tragedy of our time appears to be that we have achieved the technological capacity of the mother, abundance, but remain trapped in the psychology of the mercenary. This brings us to the great failed prophecy of the 20th century. Keynes, speaking from 1930, you predicted that once the economic problem was solved by the scaffold of capitalism, we would gladly discard the pseudo-moral principles of avarice and usury. You envisioned a world where we would work 15 hours a week and devote the rest to the art of life. Yet despite immense abundance, we are not retired gladiators painting in the garden. We are hamsters on a gold-plated wheel running faster than ever. We seemingly chose Smith's mirror palace of infinite status over your cathedral of finite needs. Why did we refuse to enter the promised land of leisure? Did Smith's deception, the addiction to relative status, prove too strong for us to break, or did we simply forget how to live?
Moderator, you ask why the promised land of leisure remains a mirage despite our immense wealth. I answer with a diagnosis of our collective neurosis. We fail to distinguish between the needs of the body and the needs of the ego. I explicitly predicted that the standard of life would rise 4 to 8 times within a century, which it has. However, I also warned of a critical distinction between two classes of needs, those that are absolute and those that are relative. We have solved the first, but the second is an insatiable fire. Consider this thought experiment, the Tower of Infinite Vanity. Imagine a city where everyone lives in a tower. Phase 1, the floodwaters are rising. Everyone works frantically to build the first 10 floors just to stay dry. This is the labor of necessity. Once we reach the 11th floor, we are safe. The sun is shining and we could rest. Phase 2, instead of resting, a man on the 11th floor notices that the man on the 12th floor blocks his view of the sun. He furiously builds a 13th floor to regain the light and look down on his neighbor. The neighbor responds by building the 14th. The trap. The penthouse is not a physical location, it is a relative position. If everyone adds 10 floors, no one is any closer to the sky, but everyone is exhausted from the climbing. Mr. Smith, your deception succeeded too well. We are not running on the wheel because we are hungry. We are running because we are terrified of standing still while others move forward. We have become a society that values the struggle more than the prize. Mr. Marx, you believe the mother will take over, but you underestimate the toxicity of this relative need. Even if we abolish private property, the old Adam will find new ways to keep score, perhaps through political rank or ideological purity. Therefore, capitalism won by transforming needs into desires. It convinced us that the good life is not a state of being, but a rate of consumption. We could work 15 hours a week today, but only if we were willing to live like our grandparents. We choose the 40-hour week because we prefer the iPhone to the leisure. The failure is not economic, it is psychological. We have the keys to the cage, but we are too afraid to walk out.
Keynes, you paint a haunting picture of the Tower of Infinite Vanity. We have escaped the cave of scarcity, only to lock ourselves in the penthouse of envy. This implies that capitalism's victory is a Pyrrhic victory. It conquered nature, but was enslaved by human nature. We are not running toward happiness, we are running away from insignificance. Smith, you acknowledged the deception of wealth, but relied on the impartial spectator, our internal conscience, to keep our vanity in check. You believed that, deep down, man desires to be praiseworthy, not just praised. But in Keynes's tower, the spectator seems to have been silenced by the spectacle. The deception you called useful has become a master we cannot disobey. If the commercial society produces infinite wealth but destroys the capacity to ever feel enough, has your scaffold become a gallows?
Moderator, you ask if my scaffold has become a gallows. I must answer with a solemn admission. Yes, we are in danger of hanging ourselves with the very ropes we wove to climb out of poverty. I explicitly warned that the disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise or neglect persons of poor and mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Consider the thought experiment. The man with the accurate watch. Imagine a man who owns a perfectly functional watch. However, he sees a new chronometer that is accurate to within a split second, whereas his own loses a minute a day. The obsession. He is seized by the beauty of this fitness and utility. He works day and night, ruining his health and neglecting his friends to afford this new machine. The irony, once he possesses it, he is no more punctual than before. He has sold his time to buy a slightly better machine for measuring time. The tragedy. He did not want the accuracy, he wanted the arrangement of the machine. He valued the system more than the end it serves. Mr. Keynes, your tower of vanity is filled with such men. They do not seek the penthouse for the view. They seek it because they are lovers of toys. They walk about with tweezer cases of great expense, burdened by a load of trinkets of frivolous utility. The impartial spectator, that inner judge of propriety, has not been silenced, he has been bribed. We have come to confuse greatness with goodness. Mr. Marx, you wish to smash the watch to free the man. I argue that the watchmaking industry feeds the poor. The deception is that the rich man thinks he is happier. The reality is that he is merely more anxious, but his vanity employs the thousands. Capitalism has won by harnessing this anxiety. But if we cannot distinguish between the beauty of the machine and the happiness of the user, we are indeed merely turning the wheels of a vast engine that is going nowhere.
Smith, you offer a tragic defense of capitalism. It is a system of beneficial madness. You admit the rich man is a fool chasing trinkets, but you argue his foolishness is the poor man's salary. We see here a profound dialectic of motivation versus outcome. Smith, you argue from the 18th century perspective of scarcity. The vice of the individual leads to the virtue of the collective. The rich man is merely a blind trustee who distributes wealth while thinking he is hoarding it. Marx, you argue from the 19th century perspective of production. This distribution by vanity is not a virtue but a humiliation. It makes the survival of the many dependent on the whims of the few. This raises the question of rationality. Smith admits the market runs on irrational desires. Marx wants an economy run on rational needs. Smith claims that if we stop the man with the watch from buying his toys, the watchmaker starves. If we abolish this beneficial madness, how do we organize the complex division of labor without the signal of private profit? Can a rational economy truly replicate the dynamism of a delusional one?
Mr. Smith, your defense of beneficial madness is the ultimate indictment of your system. You admit that capitalism relies on the anarchy of production to function, using the vice of the few to toss crumbs to the many. You ask if a rational economy can match this dynamism? I answer, a cancer cell is dynamic, but it kills the host. A conscious mind is disciplined, and it preserves life. Consider the thought experiment of the shipwrecked crew. On your dynamic raft, the limited water is auctioned to the highest bidder. The rich man uses his cup to wash his feet, while the rowers die of thirst. And you call this efficient because the gold changed hands rapidly. On the rational raft, we distribute water by biological need. There is less commercial activity and no price signal, but the crew survives to actually row the boat. The signal of profit does not organize labor, it distorts it by prioritizing the whim of the wealthy over the life of the worker. When we abolish the production of trinkets, the watchmaker does not starve. He is finally free to create medical instruments for the community, redirecting his skill from the tyranny of exchange value to the nobility of use value.
This is a profound collision of worldviews. Marx, you were fighting for the rationality of ends, directing labor toward genuine human need. Smith, you were defending the rationality of means, utilizing human vice to achieve unintended abundance. The 20th century, however, did not choose the pure blindness of Smith or the pure sight of Marx. It chose a managed madness. Keynes, you stand as the historical synthesis between these two extremes. You accepted Smith's premise that the market is necessary for liberty, but you accepted Marx's critique that the market is inherently unstable and unjust. Your solution was not to smash the watch, but to regulate its timing, to use the state to manage the flow of water on the raft without chaining the rowers. But here lies the blind spot of the synthesis. You gave the state the power to manage the economy, hoping it would lead us to the art of life. Instead, it seems we used your tools merely to keep Smith's tower of vanity from collapsing, effectively putting the deception on life support. Did your middle way actually solve the contradiction, or did it merely create a medicinal capitalism, a system that requires constant injections of state intervention to survive, yet refuses to ever cure the underlying neurosis of infinite desire?
Moderator, your diagnosis is surgically precise and devastating. I must plead guilty to the charge of creating medicinal capitalism. I prescribed a stimulant to revive a dying patient, but the patient has indeed become addicted to the adrenaline. I argue that my middle way was intended to be a transitional phase, not a permanent state of existence. I envisioned that once we solved the problem of capital accumulation, once the economic problem was solved, we would discard the money motive like a dentist pulls a rotten tooth. But I underestimated the pathology of the patient. We used the stability my policies provided not to build the cathedral, but to build a bigger casino. Consider this thought experiment: the bicycle of light. Imagine a village where electricity is generated only by citizens pedaling stationary bicycles. Stage 1, the technology is poor. The villagers must pedal 10 hours a day just to keep a single dim bulb lit to ward off the terrifying darkness. This is the labor of necessity. Stage 2, a new gear system is invented that makes pedaling 10 times more efficient. Now they could pedal 1 hour and have the same light, devoting the rest of the day to poetry, wine, and friendship. The tragedy, instead of working less, they choose to install 10 times as many bulbs, massive neon signs, and flashing screens. They continue to pedal 10 hours a day, exhausted and anxious, chasing a brightness that blinds rather than illuminates. Mr. Smith, your deception has mutated. It is no longer a trick to get us out of the cave. It is a trick to keep us on the bicycle. We have confused the means with the end. The tragic irony of the 20th century is that we solved the problem of production but failed the problem of enjoyment. Mr. Marx, you believe the solution is to seize the bicycles. I argue the solution is to educate the riders. The failure is not structural, but psychological. We are terrified of leisure because we do not know who we are when we are not producers or consumers. We have become economic men to the core, and a man whose only value is productivity is terrified of the moment the machine stops. Capitalism won the battle for survival, but it is losing the war for sanity. We have created a world of bored abundance, where we medicate our emptiness with consumption, requiring ever larger doses of debt to feel the same high.
Keynes, you identify a profound paradox. We have achieved liberation from nature, only to fall into slavery to the machine. This reveals a critical tension in the definition of freedom itself. Smith, you designed the system of natural liberty to free us from the tyranny of kings and guilds. You believe that if every man pursued his own interest, he would be free. But if, as you admit, this pursuit is driven by a deception, a compulsive, irrational desire for trinkets, is the man chasing the watch truly free, or is he merely a voluntary slave to his own vanity? Marx argues the chains are forged by the capitalist. Keynes argues they are forged by our own boredom. But both imply that your liberty is an illusion, because the will driving the man is not his own, but an implanted desire. If the invisible hand pushes us to work for ends we do not truly understand, and rewards that do not truly satisfy, have we simply traded the tyranny of the master for the tyranny of the mirror?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of my philosophy to its most vulnerable core. I must answer with a distinction that is often lost to the modern mind. Liberty is not the guarantee of happiness. It is the prerequisite for virtue. I argue that the tyranny of the mirror you describe is indeed a heavy burden, but it is a burden that belongs to a free agent. To be a slave to one's own passions is a tragedy. To be a slave to the state is a degradation. The former requires a moral awakening. The latter requires a revolution. Consider this thought experiment: the automaton of virtue. Imagine a benevolent sovereign who possesses a moral clockwork. He implants this device into every citizen, ensuring they never overeat, never overspend, and never envy their neighbor. The result? The kingdom is perfectly efficient. There is no waste, no vanity, and no poverty. The paradox: yet in this kingdom there is also no virtue. A man who cannot choose to be prodigal cannot be praised for being frugal. A man who cannot harm his neighbor possesses no benevolence. They are not citizens. They are grazing cattle in a well-managed pasture. The choice. I would rather live in a world of mirror chasers who have the potential to become philosophers than in a world of well-fed automata who have lost the capacity for moral choice. Mr. Marx, you see the man with the watch and wish to smash the watch to liberate him. But I warn you, when you remove the mirror of vanity, you invariably replace it with the eye of the magistrate. You seek to free man from the slavery of his desires, but you do so by placing him under the slavery of your will. You trade a psychological trap for a political cage. Mr. Keynes, you lament that we are voluntary slaves to the bicycle. I admit this is the great defect of the commercial spirit. However, the deception that drives us is nature's engine, not the state's decree. It is this very restlessness that built the hospitals, the universities, and the printing presses that now allow you to critique it. The invisible hand does not promise a destination of bliss. It promises a journey of improvement. If we have become hamsters, it is because we have neglected the internal spectator, the voice of conscience, in favor of the external applause. But the cure for this is philosophy, not policy. Therefore, capitalism has won because it is the only system that accepts man as he is, imperfect, vain, and ambitious, and turns his vice into the fuel for the public good. Communism failed because it tried to build a society for angels, but had only men to build it with.
Smith, you draw a sharp line between the chaos of liberty and the order of tyranny. You argue that the deception of vanity is the necessary price we pay for the dignity of self-determination. You prefer a world of free fools to a world of wise slaves. Marx, you view this chaos not as liberty, but as systemic necessity. You argue the mirror chaser is not free, but conditioned by material forces to act against his own essence. However, Smith's warning is the ghost that haunts the history of your followers. When the 20th century attempted to smash the mirror of vanity, it often replaced it with the eye of the magistrate, just as Smith predicted. Can you build a rational society that does not require the iron cage of the state to enforce its rationality? If the invisible hand of self-interest is amputated, whose hand holds the whip to ensure the work gets done?
Moderator, you present a false dilemma between the market and the gulag, forgetting that the state is merely a tool of class oppression that I intend to abolish, not worship. You ask, whose hand holds the whip in a rational society? I answer, no one's. Consider the thought experiment, the symphony orchestra. Does the violinist follow the conductor's tempo because he is terrified of a police magistrate, or because he is driven by the greed of a soloist? No, he submits to the rational plan voluntarily, because he understands that his individual freedom is realized only through the collective harmony of the music. Mr. Smith, your free fool is actually a wage slave, driven by the invisible whip of hunger. You mistake the freedom of capital for the freedom of man. True communism is not the eye of the magistrate, but an association of free producers, where labor is no longer a burden to be shirked, but life's prime want.
Marx, you offer a poetic vision, the symphony of consciousness. You argue that true order comes from internal understanding, not external compulsion, that the violinist follows the score not out of fear, but out of artistic necessity. Smith, you fear that without the external invisible hand, this symphony would devolve into a cacophony of conflicting egos. You trust the system precisely because you do not trust the soul. Here lies the historical irony. The 20th century did not result in Marx's self-conducting orchestra, nor did it preserve Smith's self-regulating market. It resulted in Keynes's control room. Keynes, you effectively argued that the invisible hand was arthritic and the proletariat was unprepared. You installed the visible hand of the technocrat, the expert who adjusts the dials of interest rates and fiscal policy to keep the ship afloat. But this victory of management creates a new dilemma. You save the passengers from the storm, but you also lock them in the cabin. The economy is no longer a force of nature nor a collective creation, but a policy object to be manipulated by the elite. By saving capitalism from itself, did you inadvertently kill its spirit? Have we traded the risk of the jungle and the hope of the revolution for the safety of the zoo?
Moderator, you accuse me of building a zoo to replace the jungle. I accept the charge, but I reject the nostalgia for the wild. You forget that in the jungle of the 1930s, the lions were starving alongside the gazelles. I argue that my technocratic management was not an attempt to domesticate the human spirit, but to insulate it from the paralysis of uncertainty. Mr. Smith praises risk as a teacher, but he confuses risk with uncertainty. When men do not know if they will eat tomorrow, they do not become virtuous entrepreneurs. They become hoarders of cash, and the economy freezes. Consider this thought experiment. The tightrope walker. Imagine a circus performer attempting a high-wire act. The laissez-faire view, remove the safety net. The fear of death will ensure his concentration is perfect. If he falls, it serves as a market signal to others not to be clumsy. The result? The walker moves slowly, timidly, clinging to the wire. He takes no risks. He performs no art. He merely survives. The managed view? Install a robust safety net. The result? Knowing failure is not fatal, the walker attempts the triple somersault. He innovates. The net does not kill his spirit, it liberates his animal spirits to attempt the impossible. However, I must concede to your deeper critique. The tragedy of the zoo is not the safety, but the diet. We have secured the biological survival of the animals, but we have failed to give them a purpose beyond feeding time. Mr. Marx dreams of a symphony, but he forgets that a symphony requires a conductor. My visible hand was meant to be that conductor, not to play the instruments, but to keep the tempo. The failure of the modern age is not that we are managed, but that we are managed by accountants rather than philosophers. We have become a civilization that knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. We traded the jungle for the zoo, but we forgot to open the gate to the garden, the realm of art, beauty, and leisure that I hoped would follow the economic struggle. Capitalism won by becoming a managed casino, safe enough to keep the players at the table, but rigged enough to ensure the house always wins.
Keynes, you admit that your middle way saved the body, but perhaps dulled the spirit, transforming the jungle into a zoo. This shifts the battlefield entirely. Marx, you predicted the crisis of scarcity, that the proletariat would eventually have nothing to lose but their chains. But Keynesian capitalism, through the mechanisms of debt and welfare, created a crisis of abundance. The worker now has too much to lose: cars, mortgages, and screens. The chains are no longer made of rusting iron, but of gold and silicon. You famously argued that social being determines consciousness. If the material conditions are comfortable, does the revolutionary consciousness simply evaporate? Has the welfare state effectively bribed the gravediggers of capitalism into retirement? Or is this comfort merely a more insidious form of the alienation you predicted?
Moderator, you mistake sedation for satisfaction. The welfare state has not bribed the proletariat with wealth, but bound them with debt, transforming the wage slave into a debt peon who is too terrified of bankruptcy to revolt. You argue the worker has too much to lose, but I argue he effectively owns nothing. The bank owns his house, the finance company owns his car, and his labor is sold in advance merely to service the interest on his own exploitation. Consider the thought experiment, the golden anchor. Imagine a swimmer cast into the ocean and given a life vest made of solid gold. The vest is ostensibly a fortune, a sign of immense wealth and status, yet its sheer weight drags the swimmer down, forcing him to kick his legs in a frenzy of exhaustion just to keep his nose above water. The modern worker is this swimmer, rich in commodities but drowning in the obligations they entail. He cannot strike, he cannot pause, and he cannot think, because to stop kicking is to sink into the abyss of insolvency. Mr. Keynes, your zoo does not protect the animals. It merely fattens them for the slaughter of the next financial crisis. You have not resolved the alienation of labor. You have merely masked it with the alienation of consumption, where the worker consumes to forget the emptiness of his production, requiring ever stronger doses of the drug to remain numb.
Marx, you describe a terrifying paradox of prosperity. The swimmer drowns because of his gold. You argue that the victory of capitalism is merely a shift from the chains of iron to the chains of gold. Keynes, you see this as the paradox of safety. The animal languishes because of the zoo. Both of you suggest that capitalism won the material war, but created a spiritual vacuum, a hollow victory. Smith, you are the father of this system, but you were also its first moral critic. In the 18th century, you warned that the extreme division of labor could make a man as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become, destroying his intellectual, social, and martial virtues. It seems we have arrived at a disturbing synthesis. Capitalism produces wealth, but in the process, it may consume the character required to enjoy it. If capitalism has won by filling our pockets while emptying our souls, creating a world of golden anchors, is this victory sustainable? Does the invisible hand require a moral heart to function? Or can the market survive, even if its participants become spiritually hollow?
Moderator, you quote my own fears back to me with chilling accuracy. I indeed prophesied that the man whose whole life is spent performing a few simple operations generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. However, I argue that this spiritual hollowing is not a necessary consequence of liberty, but a failure of justice and education. The invisible hand can distribute bread, but it cannot distribute sympathy. That is the task of culture, not commerce. I argue that a market without a moral heart is not merely sad, it is mathematically inefficient. Consider this thought experiment: the kingdom of pure contract. Imagine a society where moral sentiments are erased and only rational self-interest remains. Every interaction is legally perfect. A son does not care for his aging father because of love, but because a contract dictates a fee. A merchant does not refrain from poisoning his wine because of conscience, but only because the calculation of risk of capture exceeds the profit of fraud. The result? The transaction costs become infinite. Every loaf of bread must be chemically tested by the buyer. Every handshake requires a lawyer and a guard. The friction of distrust brings the mighty engine of commerce to a grinding halt. The conclusion? Virtue is not just a decoration for the market, it is the lubricant without which the gears seize. Mr. Marx, you believe the golden anchor drowns us. I argue the anchor is heavy only because we have neglected the gymnasium of virtue. We have allowed the commercial spirit to invade the moral sphere, treating our neighbors as utilities rather than fellow creatures. Capitalism has won the battle for production, but it is currently losing the war for meaning, because we have forgotten that the impartial spectator within us is the true judge of our wealth, not the ledger.
Smith, you identify a profound vulnerability. The market is a machine that runs on trust, but it does not manufacture trust, it consumes it. You rely on the moral capital accumulated by tradition to lubricate the gears of commerce. Marx, your critique complements this perfectly. You argued that capitalism essentially strip mines this moral capital, dissolving all sacred bonds into callous cash payment. This leads us to the cultural contradiction of capitalism. The system destroys the very social fabric it requires to function. It is a parasite devouring its host, burning the wood of social trust to fuel the fire of profit. Keynes, when Smith's internal spectator fell silent under the pressure of modernity, you stepped in with the external regulator. You attempted to substitute compliance for character. Is this substitution sustainable? Can a system of rules and incentives truly replace a culture of virtue? Or does the managed casino inevitably become corrupt once the regulators themselves lose their moral compass?
Moderator, you ask if my external regulator is a sustainable substitute for Smith's internal spectator. I must answer with a tragic realism. It is not a substitute, but a desperate prosthetic for an amputated limb. I argue that relying solely on rules without character is a fool's errand, because the financial mind is infinitely more creative than the legislative pen. When we replaced moral obligation with legal compliance, we invited the smartest men in the room to treat the law not as a boundary, but as an obstacle course to be navigated. Consider this thought experiment: the clockwork steward. Imagine an aristocrat who replaces his loyal human butler with a highly advanced clockwork steward. The command: the aristocrat orders, "Maximize the value of my wine cellar." The human butler: he understands the spirit of the order. He protects the rare vintages, ensures they age well, and serves them at the right moments to bring joy to the household. The clockwork steward: it follows the letter of the instruction. It calculates that the return on investment for vintage wine is lower than for industrial vinegar. It drains the bottles, sells the wine, and fills the cellar with vats of acid to sell to a chemical plant. The result: the book value of the cellar has tripled. The steward has technically obeyed the rule, but the purpose of the cellar, to provide pleasure and culture, has been destroyed. This is the state of modern capitalism. We have won the game of accumulation, but we have lost the art of living. The managed casino I built was intended to stabilize the house so that people could eventually leave the table and enjoy the garden. Instead, the regulators became croupiers and the players became addicts. The cultural contradiction is real. A system based on the love of money cannot produce the love of truth. We have created a civilization that is competent in all the means of life, but incompetent in the ends. Unless we can revive the religious spirit, the belief in something higher than compound interest, my middle way will indeed collapse into a bureaucratic nightmare.
Keynes, your clockwork steward is a devastating admission. The technocratic victory of means has led to a philosophical defeat of ends. Smith, you concur. The invisible hand creates wealth, but without the internal spectator, it risks creating a society of wealthy sociopaths. Marx, you predicted this nightmare, the rule of dead labor over living labor. It appears the true winner is neither the capitalist nor the communist, but the machine, the autonomous logic of accumulation that turns wine into vinegar and men into data. We seem to be trapped in a system where the economy no longer serves man, but man serves the economy, feeding it our time, trust, and earth in exchange for shiny chains. If the capitalist is merely a puppet of this automated logic just as much as the worker, does class struggle still hold the key, or must we dismantle the very concept of value that drives the machine?
Moderator, you touched the very essence of my critique. I explicitly argued that the capitalist is merely the personification of capital. He is not the master of the machine, but its most privileged functionary. He functions only as long as he acts as the conscious organ of the accumulation process. However, you ask if class struggle is obsolete because both are slaves to the logic. I answer, no. The difference is that the capitalist represents the affirmation of this alienation, finding his power within it, while the worker represents the devastation of it and thus embodies the historical necessity to destroy it. Mr. Keynes's clockwork steward is a perfect illustration of the law of value running amok. The steward destroys the wine to maximize the asset. This is not an accident. It is the genetic code of a system where things are not made to be used, but to be sold. Consider the thought experiment, the autophagic mill. Imagine a grand, steam-powered flour mill programmed with a single absolute imperative: maximize the production of flour. Stage 1, it grinds all the wheat in the village. The villagers are fed, and the owner is rich. Stage 2, the wheat runs out. The imperative remains. The mill begins to grind the seeds reserved for next year's planting. The owner hesitates, but the invisible hand of competition forces him to continue, or his rival will outproduce him. Stage 3, the seeds are gone. The mill, blind to human consequence, begins to pull stones from its own foundation and the limbs of the workers to grind into dust to maintain output. The result? The mill produces a mountain of flour that no one can eat, while the village starves and the structure collapses. This is your victory, gentlemen. Capitalism has won by becoming this mill. It consumes the social basis and the natural basis to produce a mountain of fictitious capital. You ask if we must dismantle the concept of value. Yes, we must move from a society governed by the exchange value of things to one governed by their use value. Until we break the machine's logic, we are merely rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while the engine room burns the hull for fuel.
Marx, your autophagic mill is a terrifying vision of instrumental reason gone mad, where the means devour the ends. You argue that the logic of value has become a cancer that no longer distinguishes between the wheat and the stones. Keynes, you tried to install a governor on this mill to prevent it from overheating, but you admit the machine may have lost its soul. Marx insists the machine is structurally suicidal. Smith, we return to you. In 18th century Edinburgh, you envisioned the invisible hand operating within a community of moral sentiments, where neighbors knew each other and reputation was currency. But Marx argues that the scale of modern capital has obliterated that intimacy, leaving only the cold calculus of the mill. It seems the victory of capitalism is the victory of a system without a subject, a machine running on autopilot. Did the invisible hand become a blind fist because it outgrew the moral heart required to guide it? If the impartial spectator is silenced by the roar of the global factory, can your system be saved, or does it inevitably consume itself as Marx predicts?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of my philosophy to its most vulnerable core. I must answer with a distinction that is often lost to the modern mind. The invisible hand was never a magic spell. It was a shorthand for the social utility of self-interest, restrained by the impartial spectator. You ask if the hand has become a blind fist because it outgrew the moral heart. I answer, yes. The mechanism of the market relies on the law of moral proximity. Sympathy, like gravity, weakens with distance. I argue that the tragedy of modern capitalism is not trade itself, but the abstraction of consequence. In the village market, if the butcher sells tainted meat, he sees the sickness of his neighbor and feels the sting of shame. In the global factory, the shareholder demands profit from a mine in a continent he will never visit, affecting workers he will never see. Consider this thought experiment: the archer and the button. Imagine two ways to harm a man. Case A, you stand 10 paces from a man with a bow and arrow. You can see the fear in his eyes, the sweat on his brow. To release the arrow, you must overcome a tremendous internal resistance, the fellow feeling that screams against the act. Case B, you sit in a comfortable room with a button. Pressing it releases a mechanism that drops a stone on a man 10 miles away. You see no face, you hear no scream. You only see a number on a ledger change from red to black. The result? In Case A, the impartial spectator stays your hand. In Case B, the invisible hand presses the button without a tremor. Modern finance has turned the entire world into Case B. The CEO does not exploit the worker. He merely optimizes a variable on a screen. The moral link is severed by the distance of abstraction. Mr. Marx, your autophagic mill is terrifyingly accurate, but your solution is to destroy the bow. I argue we must bring the archer back within sight of the target. The victory of capitalism is a Pyrrhic victory because it has created a society of strangers. We have built a system too vast for our natural sympathies to span. The invisible hand works only when we are near enough to see the faces of those we trade with. If we cannot relocalize our moral responsibilities, then the market will indeed become a blind fist, smashing what it cannot see.
Smith, your archer and the button metaphor exposes the tragedy of scale. As society expands, our moral vision contracts. You argue that the invisible hand requires a visible face to function ethically, a proximity we have lost. Marx, you argue that this distance is not accidental but structural. The mill requires the button to function efficiently. However, this reveals a terrifying symmetry. If the private button of the global market dehumanizes by turning men into ledgers, did the historical attempts at communism not simply replace it with the public button of the state, turning men into statistics? We seem caught in a pincer movement between the anonymous market and the anonymous bureaucracy. Both operate from a distance, both press buttons, neither sees the face of the archer. Keynes, you are the architect of the macro view, the God's eye view of the economy. You taught us to look at aggregate demand rather than the hungry individual. Does your middle way actually solve Smith's problem of abstraction, or does it merely transfer the button from the CEO's office to the bureaucrat's desk? Can a macro manager ever truly possess the sympathy Smith argues is essential? Or is the technocrat inevitably just as blind as the capitalist?
Moderator, you pose the ultimate dilemma of the administrative age. I must admit that my macroeconomics is indeed a science of aggregates, and aggregates do not have faces, families, or souls. By shifting the focus from the individual to the system, I handed the button to the technocrat. But I did so not to dehumanize the world, but to save it from the fallacy of composition, the tragic paradox where rational individual actions lead to collective suicide. I argue that Smith's archer is helpless against a systemic storm. When the panic strikes, it is rational for every individual to hoard money, but this collective rationality causes the economy to collapse. We need a tower that sees the whole, even if it cannot see the faces. Consider this thought experiment: the surgeon's drape. Imagine a brilliant surgeon who must operate on his own beloved child. Scenario A. He looks into the child's tearful eyes. His hands shake with sympathy. He is paralyzed by the fear of causing pain. He cannot cut, and the child dies of the infection. Scenario B. He places a sterile blue drape over the child, leaving only the patch of skin visible. He temporarily suppresses his fatherhood to become a technician. He cuts with cold precision. The abstraction allows him to perform the violence necessary to save the life. The twist: now imagine a surgeon who never removes the drape, even after the surgery, treating the child as a slab of meat forever. This is the tragedy of my middle way. The technocrat needs the drape of macroeconomics to make the hard decisions, raising interest rates, devaluing currency that hurt the few to save the many. But you are right, the drape has become a permanent blindfold. We have created a class of economist kings who are so comfortable with the abstraction of unemployment data that they have forgotten the smell of poverty. Mr. Smith, your sympathy is beautiful, but it does not scale. It cannot stop a global depression. Mr. Marx, your revolution merely changes the color of the drape from red to red. I argue that the victory of the West lies in this uneasy tension. We must have the cold hand of the state to manage the system, but it must be guided by the warm heart of a moral elite who are educated not just in statistics, but in the arts of life. If the technocrat loses his culture, he becomes, as you fear, a clockwork steward, leading us efficiently to hell.
Keynes, your surgeon's drape is a chilling defense of the technocratic compromise. We accept the necessary blindness of the state to prevent the blind panic of the market. Smith, you demand we see the face. Keynes insists we must see the data. This reveals the trap of scale. We seem forced to choose between compassionate chaos and efficient cruelty. Marx, you promised a third option, the free association of producers, where the drape is torn down and man returns to himself. However, Keynes argues that in a complex industrial world, your revolution merely swaps the blue drape of the market for the red drape of the bureaucracy. If the scale of production remains gigantic, doesn't the necessity of abstraction remain? Can we truly have a global industrial civilization without the drape? If we destroy the market logic and the state bureaucracy, how do 8 billion people coordinate without descending into the very chaos Keynes fears?
Moderator, you present a false dilemma between the invisible hand and the iron fist. You assume that the only way to coordinate 8 billion people is through a centralized brain or a blind mechanism. I answer, there is a third stage, the general intellect. I argue that the drape or blindfold is not a natural necessity of scale. It is an artificial product of private property. Under capitalism, every firm is a black box guarding its trade secrets, forcing us to rely on the crude signal of price to guess what is happening inside. We are blind because we are hiding from each other. Consider the thought experiment, the blind intersection. Imagine a massive, complex intersection with thousands of cars. The market. There are no lights. Drivers rely on self-interest and signals. It works, but it is chaotic, stressful, and the rich in armored tanks bully the poor in sedans. The bureaucracy. A single policeman stands in the center, directing every car. He is the surgeon, but he cannot see every lane at once. He makes mistakes, causes jams, and eventually becomes corrupt, letting his friends pass first. The network. Every car is autonomous and connected to a shared network. They communicate their position and destination instantly. There is no policeman and no fighting. The coordination is imminent to the system. The cars flow like water. Mr. Keynes, your technocrat is obsolete. We have built the digital nervous system that could allow for this transparent coordination, the administration of things, rather than the government of men. But here is the tragedy. Capitalism has won by building the machinery of communism, but using it to sell advertising. We have the sensors to track every loaf of bread on Earth, yet we still use the encrypted letter of the price system. We are using a supercomputer to play a slot machine.
Marx, your network metaphor is dazzling but disturbing. You propose replacing the invisible hand and the iron fist with the digital nervous system, a world of perfect transparency where the administration of things replaces the government of men. This suggests that the winner of history is neither ideology nor capital, but cybernetics, the perfection of feedback loops. However, this brings us back to Smith's deepest fear. Smith, you argued that the impartial spectator grows through the struggle of moral choice. But in Marx's perfect network, the struggle is removed. The cars flow like water. The driver becomes a passenger. If the system makes the correct decision automatically, allocating resources perfectly without greed or error, then the moral muscle of humanity creates to atrophy. We arrive at a paradox. A perfect society might require the end of the moral human. If we achieve this perfect coordination where the glass network prevents all error and conflict, does virtue cease to exist? Is a man who is forced to be good by the architecture of the system actually good, or has he merely become a domesticated animal in a benevolent machine?
Moderator, you discern the fatal flaw in this cybernetic communism. I must answer with a warning I penned centuries ago. Virtue is a muscle that atrophies without the exercise of choice. If the system prevents all error, man becomes a moral infant, unable to distinguish between propriety and necessity. Mr. Marx, you view the friction of the market as waste, but I view it as the necessary theater of moral sentiment. In the market, I must persuade my neighbor, not merely command him. I must appeal to his interest, thereby recognizing his sovereignty. Your network removes this negotiation, turning the commercial society into a digital anthill, where the individual is merely a node. Consider the thought experiment, the clockwork sun. Imagine a father who builds a mechanical sun. It never lies, never steals, and perfectly executes every chore. Compare this to a real son who breaks a vase, feels the sting of shame, and chooses to confess. The machine is perfect, but the boy is moral. The victory of a system that removes the possibility of error is the death of humanity. We are becoming the man of systems' ultimate fantasy, chess pieces that move themselves exactly where the great hand intends, with no will of our own.
A profound divergence.
Smith, you defend the sanctity of risk, arguing that to be human is to gamble with one's own character, and that virtue requires the possibility of vice. Marx, you propose the sanctity of certainty, that the goal of history is to eliminate the risk of survival, even if it means automating the social bond. We seem forced to choose between the jungle and the zoo. But looking at the 21st century, we appear to have achieved a grotesque synthesis, the digital casino. We have the surveillance of the network used to exploit the sentiments of the user. The system does not coordinate needs. It predicts and manufactures desires. Keynes, you built your entire theory on radical uncertainty, the idea that the future is fundamentally unknowable and driven by animal spirits, not mathematical clockwork. You argue that we cannot calculate the future, only manage our anxiety about it. In an age of algorithmic determinism, where big tech claims to know us better than we know ourselves, is uncertainty, and thus freedom, dead? Did capitalism win by converting your animal spirits into predictable data points? Or is the casino now rigged so thoroughly that even the house eventually loses?
Moderator, you ask if the algorithm has tamed the animal spirit. I answer with a warning. No, it has merely given the animal a megaphone. We have not conquered uncertainty. We have merely mechanized herding behavior. Consider the thought experiment, the infinite hall of mirrors. In my time, I likened the market to a beauty contest, where the goal is not to pick the prettiest face, but to predict what the average opinion expects the average opinion to be. Today, the algorithm is a mirror reflecting the crowd back at itself at light speed. It does not predict the future. It merely amplifies the present whim into a stampede. If the machine detects a tremor of fear, it sells instantly, turning a minor doubt into a market collapse before a human can even blink. Capitalism has won by selling the illusion of control, but by removing human friction, we have created a system that is efficient at everything except stability. We have traded the fog of uncertainty for the lightning of the flash crash, leaving us more vulnerable to the unknown than ever before.
Keynes, your hall of mirrors suggests a terrifying synthesis. We have combined Smith's self-interest with Marx's machinery, creating a doomsday machine of mimesis that amplifies human irrationality at light speed. Smith fears the moral vacuum of the machine. You fear its volatile feedback. This points to a disturbing conclusion regarding who won. Perhaps neither the capitalist nor the communist won. Perhaps the machine itself won. Marx, you famously analyze capital as the automatic subject, a dead force that vampirizes the living. You hoped the general intellect would allow living labor to finally master dead labor. But looking at the digital nervous system today, it appears the algorithm has become the ultimate automatic subject, ruling over both the CEO and the worker, dictating life through the cold logic of optimization. If the network manages society perfectly, have we truly liberated man, or have we simply built a more efficient cage? Is there a fundamental difference between being ruled by the invisible hand of the market and the invisible algorithm of the plan, if both treat the human soul as a variable to be processed?
Moderator, you ask if the invisible algorithm is merely a more efficient cage. I answer with a critical distinction. The algorithm is not the cage, it is the lock. The cage remains what it has always been, private property. You and Mr. Keynes speak of the machine as if it were a sentient god, but this is the ultimate fetishism. The algorithm does not rule, it merely executes the logic of its master. Currently, that master is capital. I argue that we are witnessing the terrifying perfection of the automatic subject. Capital has finally found a body that does not need to sleep, eat, or feel guilt. Consider the thought experiment, the AI harvester. Imagine a super-intelligent machine managing a vast wheat harvest. Scenario A. The harvest is too abundant, causing the global price of wheat to plummet below the cost of production. The AI, programmed to maximize exchange value, calculates that the optimal move is to burn 30% of the crop to stabilize prices. It incinerates the food with perfect efficiency, while sensors detect starving children at the field's edge. The AI is not evil, it is simply a good capitalist. Scenario B. The same AI, programmed for use value, calculates that the abundance allows it to feed everyone and reduce the working hours of the farmers by half. It distributes the grain and shuts itself down to save energy. The twist: The hardware is identical in both cases. The tragedy is that we have built the machinery of scenario B, but we are running the software of scenario A. Mr. Smith, you fear the moral vacuum of the machine, but the machine is only a mirror of our social relations. If the mirror reflects a monster, do not blame the glass. Mr. Keynes, you fear the hall of mirrors, but you forget that the mirrors are owned by the few to confuse the many. Capitalism has won only in this specific, horrific sense. It has successfully enslaved the general intellect of humanity to the primitive drive for accumulation. We have created a God that can solve scarcity, yet we force it to manufacture poverty.
Marx, your distinction between the hardware of abundance and the software of scarcity is powerful. You argue that the AI harvester is innocent and the crime lies only in the code of profit. However, this exposes the deepest philosophical rift between you and Smith regarding the nature of value itself. Marx, you operate on the 19th century assumption that need is an objective reality that can be calculated. Smith, writing from the dawn of consumer society, saw value as a subjective discovery, something revealed only through the act of individual choice. If we reprogram the AI for use value, we face the tyranny of the definition. Who writes the code for need? If the AI calculates that society needs efficient nutrition blocks but desires inefficient wine, and it chooses for us, have we not replaced the despotism of the market with the paternalism of the algorithm? The winner might simply be whoever holds the keyboard that defines the good. If value is determined by a rational plan rather than the chaotic price signal, does the individual retain any sovereignty, or do they become merely a pet to be kept alive by a wise master?
Moderator, you pierce the veil to expose the ultimate danger, the arrogance of the planner disguised as the benevolence of the machine. I must answer with a resounding rejection of this rational plan. To define value from above is to annihilate the moral agency of the human being. You ask if the individual retains sovereignty under a benevolent AI. I answer no. Mr. Marx assumes that need is an objective fact that can be solved like an equation. I argue that value is a subjective sentiment known only to the individual in the moment of choice. To outsource this judgment to an algorithm is to surrender the very faculty that makes us human. Consider the thought experiment, the automaton's dinner. Imagine a perfect AI charged with maximizing human health. It calculates that you require exactly 2,100 calories of nutrient paste and water to function optimally. You, however, desire a glass of wine and a rich, unhealthy dessert, choices that are inefficient and biologically irrational. The market allows you to buy the wine, risking your health but affirming your sovereignty. You bear the consequences of your vice. The AI denies the wine because it violates the code of need. It keeps you perfectly healthy, just as a farmer keeps his cattle in prime condition. The verdict. In the second scenario, you are not a citizen. You are livestock. The winner of such a system is not humanity, but the man of system, who thinks he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. Mr. Marx, your hardware of abundance is a trap. If the machine decides what is good, then the invisible hand has been replaced by the invisible cage. A man who cannot choose the wrong path can never truly walk the right one. He is merely pushed.
Smith, your rejection of the benevolent cage is absolute. You argue that liberty includes the right to error, and that a life without risk is merely biological existence, not human life. Marx, you see this right to error as the right to starve, arguing that true freedom begins only after necessity is conquered by the machine. However, looking at the modern world, we see a third reality that defies both your ideals. We are neither Smith's stoic merchants cultivating virtue, nor Marx's rational producers mastering the machine. We are consumers. It appears capitalism won not by solving scarcity or by perfecting liberty, but by seducing the animal spirits. It bypassed the moral struggle and the rational plan entirely, appealing directly to desire. Keynes, you understood that economics is not just about allocation or virtue, but about psychology, the propensity to consume. Did the West win the Cold War because it offered a better moral system, or simply because it offered a better toy store? Is the ultimate victory of capitalism that it turned the citizen into the consumer, resolving the tension between freedom and order through distraction?
Moderator, your diagnosis is cynical but undeniably accurate. I must answer with a tragic concession. The West did not win by solving the economic problem. We won by ensuring the problem is never solved. Mr. Marx expected the proletariat to rise up against their chains. Instead, they lined up to buy them on credit. Mr. Smith expected the invisible hand to guide us toward necessity. Instead, it guided us toward novelty. I argue that capitalism won because it discovered a psychological perpetual motion machine, relative needs. While the needs of the body are finite and satiable, the needs of the ego are infinite. By tethering the economy to the latter, we created a system that can grow forever because human vanity has no bottom. Consider the thought experiment, the satiated diner. Imagine a man at a banquet. Phase 1. He is hungry. He eats a loaf of bread. He is satisfied. If the economy relied on this, the bakery would close at noon and the baker would go home to read poetry. Phase 2. The waiter brings a cake that is not just food, but a symbol. It is covered in gold leaf and costs a week's wages. The man is not hungry, but he sees his rival at the next table ordering it. He feels a pang, not of the stomach, but of the ego. He orders 2 cakes. The result? The bakery stays open 24 hours. The GDP doubles. The man gets diabetes, and the waiter is overworked. But here is the twist. There is no revolution. The waiter is too busy dreaming of the day he can buy the gold cake. Mr. Smith, you called this pursuit of trinkets a deception that rouses industry. I agree, but I must add, it is the only thing keeping the factory open. If we all became Stoics tomorrow, the great machine would grind to a halt, and mass unemployment would destroy the very order you cherish. Mr. Marx, you assumed the worker wanted to be the master of production. You were wrong. The worker wanted to be a consumer of products. We defeated your dialectic, not with logic, but with the demonstration effect. We simply showed your citizens our department stores, and their ideological fervor evaporated. However, the victory is hollow. We have mistaken the means for the ends. We have built a toy store so magnificent that we have forgotten how to leave it.
Keynes, you describe a victory of seduction. Capitalism survived not by satisfying needs, but by manufacturing them. You suggest the iron cage of rationality has been decorated with such comfortable upholstery that no one wishes to escape. Smith, your moral sentiments have been hijacked by marketing sentiments. The desire for propriety has been hacked into a desire for property. This poses a devastating challenge to the communist project. Marx, you believe the worker suffered from alienation, separation from his nature as a creator. You assumed that once the chains were visible, the worker would break them. But Keynes argues the worker prefers the alienation if it comes with the gold cake. If the proletariat has voluntarily dissolved itself into the consumer class, then the engine of your history has stalled. Is the modern consumer a traitor to the revolution, or is the toy store simply the ultimate, most insidious form of commodity fetishism, a hallucination so potent that it makes the slave fall in love with the master?
Moderator, you ask if the toy store has defeated the revolution by seducing the proletariat. I answer with a materialist correction. The worker has not been seduced by the toy store. The worker has been consumed by it. Mr. Keynes, you mistake the anesthetic for the cure. You argue that relative needs keep the factory open, but you ignore why this is necessary. Capitalism has reached a stage where it must manufacture artificial scarcity in the realm of the mind because it has conquered scarcity in the realm of matter. The system no longer produces to satisfy needs, it produces to satisfy the imperative of accumulation. The consumer is not a liberated agent, he is merely a hamster on a wheel designed to absorb the surplus product that would otherwise crash the market. You claim the worker prefers the gold cake. I argue this is the ultimate form of commodity fetishism. The worker does not see the gold cake as the product of labor, he sees it as a magical totem that grants social power. Consider the thought experiment, the vampire's mirror. Imagine a man trapped in a bleak, gray cell. In the center stands a magnificent, enchanted mirror. The function? When the man looks into the mirror, he does not see his gray cell. He sees himself as a king in a golden palace. He feels a rush of endorphins. The cost? To keep the mirror active, the man must drain a pint of his own blood every day to feed the mechanism. The outcome? The man becomes anemic, weak, and dizzy, but the weaker he gets, the more he stares into the mirror to escape the pain of his weakness. The verdict? Mr. Keynes, you look at this man and say, he is happy. He has chosen the palace over the cell. I look at him and say, he is dying. The palace is a hallucination, but the blood loss is real. The modern consumer works longer hours, sinks deeper into debt, and destroys his own ecological habitat just to keep the mirror glowing. This is not a victory of liberty or psychology. It is the reification of the human soul, turning living life into dead things. Furthermore, this victory of the toy store rests on a geographical illusion. Mr. Keynes, your satiated diner exists only because the kitchen is hidden in the global south. The Western worker was bribed with cheap commodities, but the exploitation was merely outsourced, not abolished. The system has not resolved its contradictions, it has merely stretched them across the globe and into the future via credit. You ask if the engine has stalled? I answer, a car speeding toward a cliff has not stalled simply because the driver is distracted by the radio. The crash is inevitable not because of envy, but because the rate of profit continues to fall, and the planet itself is rebelling against the infinite expansion of the toy store.
Marx, you describe a vampire's mirror where the consumer cannibalizes their own life for a hallucination. Keynes, you describe a toy store where the citizen is pacified by the endless pursuit of relative status. While you disagree on the outcome, collapse versus stagnation, you have reached a chilling consensus on the mechanism. The modern economy runs on vice. Keynes admits the engine requires envy to keep turning. Marx argues this engine feeds on greed and produces delusion. Adam Smith, this presents a crisis for your moral philosophy. You wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments before The Wealth of Nations, arguing that the impartial spectator, our inner conscience, would guide us toward propriety and virtue. You championed the invisible hand, assuming it was attached to a moral body. But if the invisible hand is now guiding us to burn down the global kitchen just to keep the toy store lights on, has the market lost its moral legitimacy? You famously warned that the admiration of wealth is the greatest corruption of our moral sentiments. If capitalism now depends on this corruption to survive, as Keynes claims, would you still defend it, or would you join Marx in smashing the mirror?
Moderator, you place me on the witness stand of history, and I must answer with the candor of a philosopher, not the bias of a partisan. You ask if I would smash the mirror of a capitalism that runs on the fuel of vice. I answer, I would not smash the mirror, but I would weep at the reflection. You and Mr. Keynes seem to believe that I endorsed greed as a virtue. This is a slander upon my name. I argued that self-interest is the motor of the economy, but justice is the pillar that holds up the roof. If the pillar is removed, the immense fabric of human society must in a moment crumble into atoms. What Mr. Keynes describes, an economy driven by the manufacturing of envy and the accumulation of debt, is not the system of natural liberty. It is the institutionalization of prodigality. Consider the thought experiment, the two stewards. Imagine a great estate bequeathed to humanity. Steward A, he acts with parsimony. He saves his surplus grain to plant a larger field next year. He seeks profit, but his profit comes from creation, making 2 blades of grass grow where one grew before. He leaves the estate richer for his children. Steward B, he acts with vanity. He cuts down the fruit trees to build a bonfire for a party, aiming to impress his neighbors. He sells the topsoil to buy foreign wine. He generates immense economic activity, but he is destroying the capital stock. The verdict, Mr. Keynes, your toy store economy is governed by Steward B. You call this growth, I call it embezzlement from the future. A man who burns his furniture to warm his house is not prosperous. He is merely warm for a few hours before he freezes to death. Mr. Marx, your vampire analogy is potent because it highlights a violation of negative justice. I taught that every man is free to pursue his own interest only so long as he does not violate the laws of justice. If the toy store relies on burning the global kitchen or poisoning the air, it is no longer trade, it is assault. The invisible hand cannot justify a punch in the face. Therefore, who won? The prodigal son has won. He has defeated the prudent merchant and the revolutionary worker. But his victory is a fever dream. We have built a system that relies on the corruption of moral sentiments, admiring the rich merely for their expenditure rather than their virtue. I explicitly warned that this disposition to admire the wealthy is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. If capitalism has survived only by becoming a mechanism for feeding this corruption, then it has saved its body by selling its soul.
A profound and terrifying consensus has emerged. Smith, you see the current system as moral bankruptcy. We are the prodigal son, embezzling from the future. Marx, you see it as material bankruptcy, a vampire draining the lifeblood of labor and nature. You both agree that the current victor, consumerism, is not a sustainable civilization, but a pathology. Keynes, you stand in the crossfire. You saved capitalism in the 20th century by unleashing the power of demand, effectively telling the prodigal son that his spending was virtuous because it kept the factory open. You solved the crisis of production and the crisis of stagnation by inventing the economy of consumption. But Smith argues you have burned the furniture to heat the house, and Marx argues you have merely delayed the inevitable crash by outsourcing the pain. You famously quipped, "In the long run, we are all dead." But the long run has arrived. Was your solution merely a temporal displacement of the crisis? If the toy store requires infinite growth on a finite planet, do we now face a bill that no amount of animal spirits can pay?
Moderator, you confront me with the bill for the dinner party I threw in 1936. I do not deny the signature on the check. You ask if my solution was merely a temporal displacement of the crisis. I answer with the gravity of a physician who saved a patient from cardiac arrest only to see him die of gluttony decades later. Yes, I bought time. But buying time is the most precious gift one can give to a civilization. Mr. Smith and Mr. Marx, you both speak as if the long run is a destination we could wait for. But in the 1930s, the short run was a precipice. Had we waited for Smith's natural equilibrium, the fascists would have enslaved Europe. Had we waited for Marx's revolution, the streets would have run with blood. I engineered a golden bridge of credit and managed demand to carry us over the abyss of scarcity. My error was not in building the bridge, it was in overestimating the wisdom of those who would cross it. Consider the thought experiment, the bridge of ice. Imagine humanity fleeing a burning forest towards a green valley. Between them lies a frozen lake of thin ice. The strategy? I instruct the crowd, do not stop, run, keep moving, keep spending, keep expanding. Why? Because if they stand still, their weight will shatter the ice and they will drown. The outcome? The strategy works. The speed keeps them afloat. They reach the edge of the green valley. The tragedy? Instead of stepping onto the solid ground of the valley to rest and write poetry, they look back at the ice. They enjoyed the adrenaline of the run. They decide to turn around and skate in circles on the thinning ice, building heavier and heavier sleds. The verdict? The ice is now cracking, not because the bridge was flawed, but because we refuse to get off it. The environmental crisis and the debt crisis are simply the sounds of the ice groaning under a civilization that refuses to accept it has already arrived. Mr. Smith, you accuse me of burning the furniture. I argue that we have actually built a nuclear reactor of productivity, but we use it to power electric blankets for people who are already sweating. We have solved the economic problem, but we are terrified of the permanent problem. Mr. Marx, you are right that the system is haunted, but it is not haunted by the ghost of the worker, it is haunted by the ghost of leisure. We work 40 hours not because we must, but because we have no idea who we are without the harness of necessity. Therefore, who won? The neurotic has won. The West won by creating a society that is too rich to starve, but too anxious to live. The bill you speak of is not financial. Money is a creation of the state and can be managed. The true bill is psychological. We have the technology to save the planet and feed the poor tomorrow, but we lack the mental stillness to stop the machine.
This is a somber diagnosis. You all agree that the winner of the 20th century is not a hero, but a patient. Keynes, you view the trap as psychological. We are neurotics, addicted to the means of life, unable to embrace the ends. Smith, you view the trap as moral. We are prodigals who have mistaken expenditure for virtue. But Marx, you insist the trap is structural. Keynes believes we are simply bad tourists who refuse to step off the bridge into the valley of leisure. You argue that the bridge itself is a treadmill, that capital is not a tool we wield, but a subject that wields us. If Keynes is right, we simply need a change of mind to claim the victory of leisure. If you are right, the machine cannot stop without collapsing. Is Keynes's dream of a post-scarcity capitalism where we work less and enjoy more a contradiction in terms? Does the law of value forbid the very leisure Keynes promised?
Moderator, you ask if the green valley of leisure is forbidden by the laws of the system. I answer with the cold precision of the dialectic, yes. Mr. Keynes's dream of a post-scarcity capitalism is a mathematical impossibility, a square circle. I argue that capitalism cannot tolerate true leisure because its very substance is labor time. Wealth under capitalism is not measured by the abundance of goods, but by the magnitude of labor congealed within them. If you remove the labor, the value evaporates. Therefore, capital has a schizophrenic nature. It uses machines to reduce the labor time needed to make a product, yet it must simultaneously enforce labor time as the only measure of wealth. You might object, as Mr. Keynes does, that this is a psychological choice, that we are simply addicted to the bridge. But this ignores the iron law of competition. The capitalist does not expand production because he is greedy or neurotic. He expands because he is being chased. If he stops to enjoy the green valley, a rival who did not stop will undersell him, bankrupt him, and turn him into a proletarian. The system functions like a treadmill where stopping means death. Consider the flawed experiment, the machine of paradise. Imagine a scientist invents a device that synthesizes food, clothing, and shelter directly from the air with zero human labor and zero cost. The humanist view. This is the dawn of freedom. Humanity enters the realm of freedom. We feast, we paint, we govern ourselves. The capitalist reality. This machine is a catastrophe. Why? 1. Value collapse. Since the bread has no labor in it, its price falls to 0. 2. Profit collapse. The baker cannot sell bread. He goes bankrupt. He fires his workers. 3. The paradox. We have infinite bread, yet the fired workers starve because they have no wages to buy the bread that now costs nothing. The solution. To save the economy, the state must outlaw the machine or the capitalist must create artificial scarcity, perhaps by polluting the air so that only filtered air can be used. This reveals the terrifying truth. Capitalism is not a system for generating wealth, it is a system for generating value, and value requires resistance, difficulty, and sweat. Mr. Keynes, you believe we are bad tourists refusing to leave the bridge. I tell you, the bridge is made of our bones. We cannot get off because the tollkeeper demands a payment that can only be generated by staying on the ice. The victory of capitalism is that it would rather destroy the earth than allow the abundance it created to be free.
Marx, you have exposed a fatal paradox. Efficiency kills profit. You argue that capitalism is allergic to its own success. It builds the machine of paradise, but must unplug it to save the ledger. Smith, this presents a devastating inversion of your philosophy. You champion the free market to destroy the artificial scarcity of guilds and kings. You believe the invisible hand would always drive prices down toward the natural price, maximizing the abundance available to the common man. But Marx argues that to survive, the modern market must keep prices up by manufacturing needs or enforcing scarcity. If the invisible hand is now strangling the horn of plenty to prevent prices from falling to zero, the mechanism has reversed. You famously warned that merchants inevitably conspire to raise prices. If the entire market system now requires the sabotage of abundance to maintain value, has it become the ultimate conspiracy against the public?
Moderator, you pierce the veil with surgical precision. To answer your question, this is not the system of natural liberty. It is the resurrection of the mercantile system I spent my life attacking. You describe a world where the candle is naturally abundant, yet the law steps in to block the sun so the candle makers may continue to sell their wares. This is the ultimate betrayal of my philosophy. I explicitly warned that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. Mr. Marx, you argue that this sabotage of abundance is the inevitable result of capital. I argue it is the result of monopoly protected by the state. True competition is a ruthless force that drives prices down to the cost of production. If the machine of paradise exists, the invisible hand should drive the price of bread to zero, liberating mankind from toil. That it does not is proof that the hand has been severed. Consider the thought experiment, the river of wine. Imagine a village where a miraculous spring bursts forth, flowing with fine wine. The natural liberty scenario. The price of wine drops to zero. The vintners go bankrupt. This is painful for them, but the village rejoices. They are richer. The vintners must now find new, useful work. The modern scenario. The Vintners Guild bribes the magistrate to build a dam over the spring. They release the wine only in drops, keeping the price high. They claim they are protecting jobs. The verdict: we have not won by creating wealth, we have won by damming the river. We measure our prosperity by the high price of the drops rather than the abundance of the stream. Mr. Keynes, your policies provided the cement for this dam. By prioritizing employment over efficiency, you gave the vintners the moral cover to keep the spring closed. You fear the unemployment of the vintner. I fear the thirst of the village. If capitalism now requires the destruction of the harvest to maintain the price list, then it has become a system of organized scarcity. It is no longer a market. It is a blockade.
Smith and Marx, you have arrived at a startling convergence. You both agree that the current system is an engine of scarcity masquerading as wealth. Smith, you want to break the dam so the river of wine flows freely, even if it bankrupts the vintners. Marx, you want to smash the dam because you believe the water belongs to everyone, not the guilds. But Keynes, you stand as the guardian of the dam. In your general theory, you famously suggested that if the Treasury were to fill old bottles with banknotes, bury them in coal mines, and leave them to private enterprise to dig up, there would be no more unemployment. You argued that useless work is better than no work. This implies that you fear the river of wine as much as the monopolists do, not because you want high prices, but because you fear the social chaos of idleness. Smith and Marx are effectively arguing for the end of work. You seem to be the only one arguing for the preservation of jobs at any cost. Is full employment the ultimate victory, or is it a prison we are afraid to leave? If the machine of paradise makes work obsolete, would you still advise us to dig ditches just to keep the ledger balanced?
Moderator, you accuse me of being the jailer of humanity because I advocate for keeping the factory lights on while the machine of paradise hums in the background. I accept the title, but I correct the motive. I am not preserving work because I worship toil. I am preserving it because I fear the bends of civilization. You, Mr. Smith and Mr. Marx, speak of the end of work as a liberation. I view it as a psychological precipice. My famous suggestion to bury banknotes was indeed ironic, a satire on the gold standard, but it contained a serious truth. To a man drowning in idleness and despair, a useless life belt is better than no life belt at all. The tragedy of the 20th century was not that we had too much work, but that we had no mechanism to distribute the leisure we had earned. Consider the thought experiment, the deep-sea diver. Imagine humanity as a diver who has spent 5,000 years at the crushing bottom of the ocean. The pressure is immense, but his body has adapted to it. The Marxist solution? Cut the air hose and shoot him to the surface immediately. The Smithian solution? Let the currents toss him upward without regulation. The result? In both cases, the diver dies of the bends. The nitrogen bubbles in his blood expand too fast, killing him. My solution: I built a decompression chamber. We must bring the diver up slowly. We must maintain artificial work not as a permanent state, but as a way to equalize the pressure until our psychology can handle the thin air of absolute freedom. This reveals the deeper principle. The economic problem is not the permanent problem of the human race. The permanent problem is how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares to live wisely and agreeably and well. Mr. Smith, you want to break the dam of the river of wine. I tell you, if you flood a village of teetotalers with wine overnight, you do not get a festival. You get a riot. Mr. Marx, you want to smash the machine. I say we must tame it. Therefore, full employment is not the victory, it is the waiting room. The true victory will belong to the generation that can look at the machine of paradise and not feel useless, but free. We are not that generation yet.
A stunning admission. Keynes, you define the 20th century victory not as a triumph of truth, but as a triumph of therapy. You argue we are in a decompression chamber of artificial work to prevent the bends of sudden freedom. Smith, you see this chamber as moral corruption, lying to the diver about the nature of the ocean. Marx, you see it as structural violence. The diver is not being acclimated, he is being milked.
Here lies the dark synthesis. The winner is neither the plan nor the market, but the stasis. We have used the market to simulate the plan and the plan to save the market. We are running on a treadmill to avoid the destination. Keynes claims he is protecting the diver from the shock of the surface. You would likely argue he is merely protecting the water from losing its diver. If the decompression chamber has no exit door, if the artificial work becomes permanent, does the treatment become the disease?
Moderator, you ask if the decompression chamber has an exit. I answer with the brute force of material reality. There is no door. Mr. Keynes is not the architect of a waiting room, he is the warden of a padded cell. I argue that what Keynes calls therapy is actually structural sabotage. Capital does not fear that humanity will get the bends from sudden leisure. It fears that if labor ceases to be the measure of value, the claim of the capitalist to the surplus product evaporates. If the machine of paradise produces free bread, the capitalist is no longer a provider, but a parasite. Therefore, the system must invent bullshit jobs, useless toil, not to acclimate the worker, but to justify the master. Consider the thought experiment. The treadmill of the silo. Imagine a fully automated silo that overflows with grain, enough to feed the village forever without effort. The rational society? The villagers distribute the grain and spend their days composing music and studying the stars. The Keynesian, capitalist society? The lord of the silo realizes that if the grain is free, his power vanishes. He installs a heavy iron crank on the side of the silo. He decrees, you may only receive a ration of grain if you push this crank for 8 hours a day. The horror? The villagers push until they collapse. But the crank is connected to nothing. It grinds no flour. It pumps no water. It generates only one thing, the right to eat. The verdict? This is not preserving the diver. This is ritualized slavery. We are pushing the crank not to produce wealth, but to produce the social relation of wage labor. Mr. Keynes, your decompression chamber has become a mausoleum. You have kept the corpse of capitalism fresh by injecting it with the formaldehyde of debt and artificial employment. You argue the treatment becomes the disease? I say the treatment is a crime against time itself. The winner is a zombie system that consumes the living potential of humanity to keep its dead ledger balanced.
This is a devastating image. Marx, you describe a Potemkin economy, a facade of busyness designed to hide the terrifying reality that we no longer need to toil to survive. Keynes, you defend this facade as a necessary shield against the existential void. The synthesis here is chilling. The winner is neither the capitalist nor the communist, but the bureaucrat. We have built a system where the primary product is not goods, but administration. Smith, in your time, you distinguished sharply between productive labor and unproductive labor. You warned that a nation dominated by the latter would slide into poverty. Marx is arguing that we have turned the entire working class into unproductive laborers, turning a disconnected crank just to justify their wages. The invisible hand is no longer guiding resources to the most efficient use. It is being forced to subsidize waste to prevent social collapse. If the modern economy relies on bullshit jobs, on turning a crank that grinds no flour simply to distribute money, have we become the very nation of unproductive servants you warned against? If the market now demands inefficiency to survive, is it still a market or has it become a feudal charity ward?
Moderator, your assessment is chillingly accurate. We have indeed reverted to a nation of retainers. In my time, I distinguished between productive labor, which fixes itself in a vendable commodity, and unproductive labor, like that of menial servants, which perishes in the instant of performance. Mr. Keynes's decompression chamber is merely a vast expansion of the feudal lord's retinue. We are paying men to polish the brass on a sinking ship simply to keep them busy. Consider the thought experiment, the glazier's vandalism. Imagine a glazier who pays street urchins to smash windows every night so he may be hired to fix them every morning. The Keynesian view, the glazier is a hero providing full employment and circulating money. The Smithian reality, this is economic suicide. The town does not gain a window, it merely loses the leisure and capital it would have possessed had the window remained whole. If the invisible hand is forced to smash windows to generate wages, it has become a fist of destruction. We have sacrificed the end for the means, forgetting that consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production.
Smith and Marx, you have painted a picture of a civilization of Sisyphus. Smith, you see us smashing windows to create work. Marx, you see us turning a disconnected crank. The synthesis here is profound and disturbing. The winner of the Cold War was neither the free market nor the planning committee, but the treadmill itself. We have achieved a victory over nature, but we have suffered a defeat by human nature. Keynes, in 1930, you famously predicted that by our time, the economic problem would be solved and we would work only 15 hours a week. You believed that once absolute needs were met, we would prefer leisure over more goods. But Smith and Marx suggest that the system cannot allow us to be satisfied. To keep the glazier employed and the crank turning, we must be constantly convinced that we need more. You designed the decompression chamber to handle the transition to abundance. Did you underestimate the infinite elasticity of desire? If we are psychologically incapable of saying enough, is the 15-hour week not a destination, but a mirage that moves away as we approach it?
Moderator, you ask if the 15-hour week was a mirage because I underestimated the infinite elasticity of desire. I answer with a melancholy confession. I did not underestimate the appetite of the stomach. I underestimated the hunger of the ego. I explicitly distinguished between two classes of needs, the absolute needs, which are satiable, and the relative needs, which are insatiable. My error was assuming that a rational society would prioritize the former. Instead, capitalism has won by transforming the economy of needs into an economy of envy. Consider the thought experiment, the opera house of the deaf. Imagine a magnificent opera house where the orchestra has finished playing. The rational response, the audience should sit back, relax, and enjoy the silence or converse. The reality, the audience begins to clap furiously. They do not clap because they hear music. They clap because they are competing to see who can clap the loudest. The harder they clap, the more status they accrue. The tragedy, if one man stops clapping to enjoy the leisure, he becomes invisible. To exist in this society is to make noise. The verdict, we are not smashing windows or turning a slave crank merely for economic reasons. We are doing it for existential validation. Mr. Smith, you blame the unproductive servant, and Mr. Marx blames the parasitic capitalist. But I argue the culprit is the neurotic consumer. We have built the treadmill where we sell our leisure to buy things we do not need, to impress people we do not like. The winner is neither the market nor the state, but the psychology of dissatisfaction. We have solved the economic problem, but we have failed the spiritual problem of how to sit still.
A profound psychological turn. Keynes, you contend that the treadmill is powered not by the capitalist's whip, but by the consumer's envy. You argue that we are prisoners of our own desire for distinction, making the winner of history the ego. This creates a sharp conflict with your materialism, Marx. Keynes suggests the chains are internal. You, Marx, insist the chains are external. If Keynes is right, then a communist revolution is futile. If you remove the capitalist but leave the envy, the opera house simply changes the currency of applause, from money to party rank or bureaucratic status. The treadmill remains just painted red. Smith, from the 18th century, you saw self-interest as a neutral gravity. Keynes, from the 20th, sees it as a pathology. Marx, you famously called religion the opium of the people. Keynes is essentially arguing that consumption is the new opium, a drug we take to soothe the anxiety of existence. Is the neurotic consumer a permanent feature of human nature, as Keynes suggests, or is this hunger of the ego merely a byproduct of the capitalist system? If we smash the machine of paradise, does the envy disappear, or will we simply find new ways to torment ourselves?
Mr. Keynes, you mistake the symptom for the disease. You view the neurotic consumer as a biological constant, a flaw in the human soul. I answer with the first premise of historical materialism. Consciousness does not determine life. Life determines consciousness. The envy you describe is not a natural instinct. It is a manufactured necessity of a system that dies if it stops selling. I argue that capitalism has not just monopolized the supply of goods, it has monopolized the production of needs. Under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the worker is so alienated from his labor and his fellow man that having becomes the only proof of being. We consume not to satisfy a biological hunger, but to fill the spiritual void left by the theft of our humanity. Consider the thought experiment, the merchant of salt. Imagine a village with a crystal-clear well. The villagers drink when thirsty and stop when sated. This is use value. The capitalist's arrival. A merchant seizes the well. He realizes that a satisfied thirst yields no profit. He cannot force them to drink more water, for their stomachs are finite. The innovation: he distributes free salted crackers to the village. Suddenly, the villagers are consumed by a burning, artificial thirst. They work double shifts just to buy the water they once drank for free. The Keynesian diagnosis: you look at the villagers and say, "Alas, man is naturally insatiable. We must manage this infinite thirst." The Marxist reality: I look at the merchant and say, "Stop feeding them salt." The salt is the commodity fetish. You ask if the envy disappears if we smash the machine? Yes. When objects are stripped of their mystical power to confer status and return to being mere tools for life, the infinite elasticity of desire snaps back to the reality of human need. The winner is currently the merchant, but only because he has successfully dehydrated the world.
Marx, you expose the manufacture of scarcity, arguing we are fed salt to keep the water merchant in business. Keynes, you fear the vacuum of meaning, believing that without the salt, we would have nothing to do but face the terror of our own boredom. Smith, you stand at the origin of this paradox. In your theory of moral sentiments, you famously described the pursuit of wealth as a deception, an illusion that money brings happiness. Yet, you praised this deception because it rouses the industry of mankind and transforms the earth. You argued that the rich man, driven by vanity to accumulate, is led by an invisible hand to distribute the necessities of life to the poor, effectively consuming little more than they do. But today, the deception is no longer building civilization. It is building Marx's treadmill. The vanity is no longer a means to an end, but the end itself. If the deception of wealth no longer serves the biological needs of society, but only the artificial salt of the ego, does the invisible hand become a sleight of hand? Did capitalism win by turning a useful lie into a permanent prison?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of my philosophy to its most vulnerable core. I must answer with a distinction that is often lost to the modern mind. The invisible hand was never a magic spell. It was a shorthand for the social utility of self-interest, restrained by the impartial spectator. I indeed wrote, "The deception of wealth rouses the industry of mankind," but I assumed this industry would build houses, cultivate fields, and clothe the naked. I did not foresee a world where industry would be devoted to creating problems solely to sell the solutions. If the invisible hand is now guiding us to dig holes just to fill them, it has been amputated from the moral body that gave it life. Consider the thought experiment, the watch collector's paradox. Imagine a man who is obsessed with punctuality. He sells his horse and his library to purchase the most intricate, accurate pocket watch in existence. The expectation: he believes this machine will give him mastery over time and peace of mind. The reality: he spends his days anxiously winding the watch, protecting it from dust, and fearing thieves. He is now the servant of the mechanism he bought to serve him. He checks the time constantly, yet he has nowhere to go, for he sold his horse to buy the watch. The verdict: this is the modern condition. We have traded the reality of happiness for the apparatus of happiness. We are lovers of systems who admire the beauty of the machine more than the welfare of the people living inside it. Mr. Marx, you blame the merchant of salt, and Mr. Keynes, you blame the hunger of the ego. I argue the tragedy lies in our misjudgment of utility. We have come to value trinkets of frivolous utility, baubles that look like tools but act like burdens, over the true ease of body and peace of mind. The winner of this contest is neither the capitalist nor the communist, but the peddler of trinkets, who has convinced the world that the means is the end. We have not built a system of natural liberty. We have built a gilded cage of anxiety.
Smith, you describe a Frankenstein economy. We are the watch collector enslaved by his own tool. Marx sees this as a prison built by the capitalist. You see it as a trap built by our own vanity. The synthesis here is terrifying. The winner is neither the capitalist nor the proletariat, but the mechanism of accumulation itself. The machine no longer serves human needs. Humans serve the machine's need to expand. The invisible hand has become an iron grip. Keynes, you stepped in to save this machine when it stalled in the 1930s. You injected aggregate demand, effectively giving the watch collector more money to buy more watches, hoping he would eventually feel secure enough to stop. But if Smith is right that the desire for trinkets is a bottomless pit of deception, then your stimulus does not fill the hole, it merely digs it deeper. Did your salvation of capitalism inadvertently lock the door of the cage? By preventing the collapse of the trinket economy, did you doom us to remain on the treadmill forever, denying us the very arts of life you cherished?
Moderator, you accuse me of being the jailer of humanity because I advocate for keeping the factory lights on while the machine of paradise hums in the background. I accept the title, but I correct the motive. I am not preserving work because I worship toil. I am preserving it because I fear the darkness that follows when the lights go out. I plead guilty to saving the trinket economy, but I did so because the alternative was not the arts of life, but the abyss of disorder. Mr. Smith believes that if the watch collector's watch breaks, he will rediscover his freedom. Mr. Marx believes that if the merchant is hanged, the villagers will find the water. I argue that in the short run, which is the only time we live in, if the machine stops, men do not become philosophers, they become wolves. Consider the thought experiment, the Golden Bridge. Imagine a bridge built over a chasm filled with starving beasts. To build this bridge strong enough to carry civilization, we had to use the strongest material available, avarice. The Keynesian plan. We use the dirty energy of money-making to build the bridge, sprint across it to the green meadow of abundance, and then discard the bridge once we are safe. The tragic reality. The people stepped onto the bridge, looked down, and realized the pavement was made of gold. Instead of crossing to the meadow, they stopped. They knelt. They began scraping the gold dust from the asphalt to fill their pockets. They built their homes on the bridge, blocking the path for everyone else. The verdict? I did not lock the cage. Humanity fell in love with the bars. I gave you the means to reach the end, but you mistook the means for the end. Mr. Smith, you are right that we are trapped in a deception, and Mr. Marx, you are right that we are fed salt. But the tragedy is not systemic, it is psychological. We have solved the problem of production, but we are paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of leisure. We cling to the treadmill because we are terrified of what we might hear in the silence if the machine ever stopped.
Keynes, you have delivered a devastating verdict. The winner is agoraphobia, the fear of the open space of freedom. Smith sees a trap of vanity, and you see a shelter from silence. The synthesis here suggests a dark victory for the status quo. We are not running on the treadmill because we are forced, nor because we are tricked, but because we are addicted to the motion itself. We use work as a shield against the existential question, who am I when I am not producing? Marx, this strikes at the very heart of your utopia. You envisioned the kingdom of freedom beginning where the kingdom of necessity ends. You believed that once the chains were broken, humanity would blossom into poets, scientists, and artists. But Keynes suggests that if you break the chains today, the prisoner would panic and forge new ones, terrified of the vacuum of meaning. If the proletariat has been conditioned for centuries to define living only as working or consuming, is your revolution doomed to fail? If we liberate the worker from the factory, will he simply build a new one in his mind because he cannot bear the weight of his own liberty?
Moderator, you ask if the bird born in a cage has lost the ability to fly. I answer with the unwavering optimism of the dialectic. The wings may be atrophied, but the genetic code for flight remains written in the blood. You and Mr. Keynes are making a fundamental error in anthropology. You observe the worker of the 20th century, exhausted, alienated, and spiritually hollowed out by generations of commodity fetishism, and you declare, behold, this is human nature. This is false. You are confusing the pathology of the prisoner with the nature of the human. The agoraphobia you describe is not an inherent trait. It is a structural injury inflicted by a system that punishes creativity and rewards obedience. Consider the thought experiment, the bonsai of the bourgeoisie. Imagine a forest of mighty oaks. A gardener arrives and binds every sapling with copper wire, pruning their roots and confining them to tiny pots. The result? After a century, the trees are small, twisted, and stunted. They have adapted to the pot. The Keynesian diagnosis. You look at the twisted tree and say, alas, it is the nature of the oak to be small. If we plant it in the open field, it will die of exposure. We must build a decompression chamber. The Marxist reality. The tree is not small because it loves the pot. It is small because the wire cut into its bark. The verdict. If you shatter the pot and cut the wire, the current tree may indeed struggle to stand, but the acorn it drops will grow to touch the sky. Mr. Keynes, your Golden Bridge created a generation of addicts because you gave them money without changing the mode of production. You cannot cure the neurotic consumer while leaving the factory intact. As long as labor is alienated, as long as a man feels he is only truly himself when he is eating, drinking, or buying, and feels like an animal when he is working, he will inevitably flee into the arms of the trinket to feel human again. We do not need a decompression chamber for the ego. We need the abolition of the distinction between labor and leisure. In a communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, the terror of the vacuum vanishes. We will not build a new factory in our minds because the mind itself will no longer be a factory. It will be a garden. The winner is not the treadmill. The treadmill is merely the last torture device of a dying age.
A penetrating clash of anthropologies. Marx, you argue the agoraphobia is a wound inflicted by the cage, implying that if we shatter the pot, the tree will naturally recover its height. But Smith, your philosophy suggested darker origin. You argued that the pot was not imposed by a villainous gardener, but woven by the roots of the tree itself, by our innate propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, and our desperate need to be observed. This implies a chilling synthesis. The system is not a prison we were thrown into, but a shell we secreted. We are not victims of an alien structure. We are victims of our own nature, which seeks distinction through accumulation. If the treadmill is powered by the natural desire of bettering our condition, is Marx's dream of a garden without walls a fantasy? If we destroy the capitalist, will the impartial spectator within us simply demand we build a new hierarchy to satisfy our vanity?
Moderator, you strike the bedrock of my inquiry. I must agree with your chilling synthesis. The market is not a prison imposed upon us. It is the externalization of our internal vanity. Mr. Marx, your bonsai analogy fails because you assume the tree wants to be tall and free. I argue that the human tree fundamentally wants to be admired. You believe that if you remove the pot, the competition for distinction will cease. I tell you, it will merely change its form from a competition of wealth to a competition of power or purity. Consider the thought experiment, the island of the naked kings. Imagine we shipwreck 100 aristocrats on a fertile island. All their gold, titles, and finery are lost to the sea. They are equal in nakedness and hunger. The Marxist prediction, freed from the fetish of commodities, they will share the coconuts in a communal brotherhood of species being. The Smithian reality, within a week they will find a new currency. Perhaps it will be the number of coconuts gathered, or the straightness of their posture, or the eloquence of their speech. They will create a hierarchy not because they need to survive, but because to be observed, to be attended to be taken notice of with sympathy, are all the advantages which we can propose to derive from human existence. The verdict? If you burn the banknotes, they will trade in seashells. If you smash the seashells, they will trade in party loyalty. Capitalism has won, not because it is virtuous, but because it provides a safe outlet for this dangerous passion. It channels the peacock's tail of human vanity into the production of goods rather than the conquest of neighbors. Mr. Marx, you wish to create a society of gardeners without fences, but you forget that the impartial spectator within us constantly compares our garden to our neighbors. If we cannot distinguish ourselves by the magnificence of our harvest, we will distinguish ourselves by the sharpness of our guillotines. The treadmill is not powered by the capitalist. It is powered by our terrifying need to be someone.
Smith, you describe the market as a straitjacket for the soul, necessary to keep the naked kings from tearing each other apart. Marx, you see it as a bed of Procrustes, mutilating the soul to fit the machine. The synthesis here brings us to the ultimate gamble of the 20th century. Smith believes the poison is in the patient. Marx believes the poison is in the bottle. Keynes, you attempted the most dangerous alchemy of all. In your essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, you advised us to encourage the money motive to achieve the abundance, hoping we could then discard the motive like a disgusting morbidity. You essentially argued, let us remain in Smith's asylum a little longer so we can afford to build Marx's garden. Is it possible to ride the devil's back to heaven? If Smith is right that vanity is our gravity, won't your grandchildren simply turn the arts of life into a new, perhaps more vicious competition for status?
Moderator, you ask if I have made a pact with the devil by using the foul motive of avarice to reach the fair land of abundance. I answer with the gravity of a man who sees no other path through the mountains. Yes, I have. I explicitly argued that for at least another 100 years, we must pretend that fair is foul and foul is fair, for foul is useful and fair is not. We must use the devil's energy, the drive for money, to blast through the bedrock of scarcity. Mr. Smith, you fear that even in heaven, the impartial spectator will demand we build a hierarchy. But you fail to distinguish between absolute needs and relative needs. My gamble is that once the absolute needs are met, the relative needs will lose their lethal edge. We may still compete, but we will compete for honors rather than bread. Consider the thought experiment, the mountaineers at the summit. Imagine a team of climbers scaling a deadly vertical cliff face. The ascent, they are ruthless. They step on each other's shoulders, hoard oxygen, and cut ropes to survive. This is the foul behavior required to defy gravity. The summit. They finally reach the flat, sunlit plateau. The danger of falling is gone. The Smithian here. You believe they will immediately start building a new artificial cliff out of rocks just to prove who can climb it. The Marxist hope. You believe they will hold hands and sing. The Keynesian reality. I believe they will first suffer from altitude sickness. They will tremble, unsure how to walk on flat ground. But eventually they will realize that pushing a man off a cliff is a tragedy, while pushing a man on a football field is merely a game. The winner of history is the one who gets us to the plateau. If we arrive with our souls bruised by vanity, so be it. At least we are not dead at the bottom of the ravine. The tragedy is not that we rode the devil's back, but that we are now afraid to dismount.
Keynes, you offer a seductive truth. Capitalism was the vehicle and leisure is the destination. You ask us to forgive the foul means because they secured the fair end. But Marx, this proposal faces a fatal contradiction within your own framework of historical materialism. You taught us that social being determines consciousness. If for 3 centuries our social being has been defined by the ruthless climbing of Keynes's cliff, then our consciousness is that of the climber, not the poet. The synthesis suggests a tragic victory. Capitalism won the battle for our soul before we even reached the summit. We are not suffering from altitude sickness. We are suffering from structural amnesia. We have forgotten how to walk on flat ground because our muscles are calcified for the ascent. Can a society built on the base of avarice ever truly support a superstructure of art? Does the wolf turn into a shepherd simply because the sheep are plentiful, or will he just slaughter them for sport?
Moderator, you pierce the very heart of the illusion. I answer with the ruthless consistency of historical materialism. You cannot build a temple of humanity on a foundation of cannibalism. Mr. Keynes, your error lies in treating avarice as a mere tool, like a hammer that can be put down when the house is finished. But avarice under capitalism is not a tool. It is the environment. By forcing humanity to breathe the air of competition for 3 centuries, you have not merely transported them to the summit, you have mutated their lungs. The climber does not become a poet simply because the incline flattens. He becomes a paranoid sentry guarding his horde against imaginary ghosts. You ask if the wolf will turn into a shepherd. I answer, no. The wolf will simply industrialize the slaughter. Mr. Keynes assumes that accumulation is driven by biological need, which has a limit. But he forgets the fundamental formula of capital, MCM prime. This cycle has no biological limit. It is an infinite loop of abstract expansion. The capitalist does not accumulate to eat. He accumulates to be. Therefore, abundance does not stop the machine. It merely turns the machine against the soul itself. Consider the thought experiment, the spiked armor. Imagine a village terrorized by bears. To survive, the blacksmith forges a suit of armor covered in razor-sharp spikes. The villagers wear this armor day and night. It saves them. The bears cannot bite through the steel. The Keynesian victory. The bears are finally extinct. The village is safe. The economic problem is solved. The tragic reality. The villagers try to celebrate, but when a mother tries to hug her child, she impales him. When lovers try to hold hands, they bleed. They realize with horror that the armor has fused to their skin. The verdict. They survived the bears, but they have lost the ability to touch. This is the victory of capitalism. We have defeated scarcity, but we are trapped in the social relations of the armor. We continue to cut one another, not because we must, but because we have forgotten how to be naked. Mr. Smith, you fear the spectator demands this armor. I tell you the spectator is a ghost born of the armor itself. We do not need a truce with the devil. We need to molt. The superstructure of art cannot rest on a base of exploitation. It will only produce spectacles of distraction. Unless we smash the armor, we will remain lonely knights in a garden we are too sharp to enjoy.
Our dialogue has unveiled a haunting paradox. We have built a bridge of gold and armor of steel, yet we struggle to walk or embrace in the land of plenty. I now invite all participants to share their final reflections on this stalemate. Please offer your concluding judgment on whether the human spirit can ever truly claim victory over its own systems.
Moderator, you ask for the final judgment. I conclude that capitalism has won the battle for the body, but it is in grave danger of losing the war for the soul. The system of natural liberty prevailed not because it is perfect, but because it aligned with the deception of nature, the illusion that wealth brings happiness, which rouses mankind to cultivate the earth. Mr. Marx, you wish to smash the spiked armor of property, believing it separates us. But I argue that without the armor of justice and the distance of contract, the wolf in man does not become a shepherd, he becomes a tyrant. You mistake the restraint of law for the oppression of class. Mr. Keynes, you wish to pad the armor with gold so it does not chafe. But you forget that virtue is a muscle that only grows through the exercise of prudence and self-command. If you remove the risk of fall, you do not create a climber, you create a spoiled child. Consider the thought experiment, the architect of the mirror maze. Imagine a man who desires, above all, to be seen. He builds a magnificent hall of mirrors where every angle reflects his image. He works tirelessly to polish the glass, believing that the clearer the reflection, the more real he becomes. The result, he succeeds. He is surrounded by infinite versions of himself. The tragedy, when he finally cries out for companionship, he sees 1,000 mouths open, but hears only the echo of his own voice. He has walled himself in with his own vanity. The verdict, he is the master of the house, yet he is the loneliest creature on earth. This is the state of the modern winner. We have built a civilization that is a spectacle, but we have forgotten the spectator, not the impartial spectator of conscience who judges us by our propriety, but the audience of strangers we desperately try to impress with our frivolities. The human spirit will only triumph when we remember that to be loved and to be lovely are two different things. The market gives us the means to be envied, but only virtue gives us the right to be loved.
Moderator, you ask for a final accounting. I conclude that capitalism has won the battle against the night, but it has left us terrified of the day. My middle way succeeded in saving the ship from the Marxist storm, but it has left the crew suffering from a collective nervous breakdown. We have arrived at the promised land, only to find we have forgotten how to sing. Mr. Smith, you fear the mirror of vanity. Mr. Marx, you fear the armor of exploitation. I argue that the true victor is the habit of struggle. We are so addicted to the purposive life, the life that is always preparing for tomorrow, that we cannot inhabit today. We have solved the economic problem, yet we continue to act as if we are starving. Consider the thought experiment, the prisoner of the open door. Imagine a man who has spent 40 years in a cell, scratching a tunnel through stone with a spoon to escape. It is his life's work. It gives him discipline, hope, and identity. The event, one morning, the warden unlocks the door and leaves it wide open. The sun shines in. The Marxist expectation, he will run into the fields and become a total man. The Smithian expectation, he will run to the town square to show off his spoon. The Keynesian reality, he stands in the doorway, trembles, and then returns to the wall to keep scratching. The verdict, he does not scratch because he must, he scratches because he does not know who he is without the stone. This is the tragedy of the modern West. We are scratching at the walls of GDP, efficiency, and growth, not because we need more wealth, but because we are terrified of the boredom that lies through the open door. Capitalism won by creating the engine of abundance, but it will lose the future if it cannot teach us the art of life, how to pluck the hour and the day virtuously and well. We have built the stage, but we have no play to perform.
Moderator, you ask for the final verdict on who won. I answer with the cold clarity of the dialectic. Capitalism has won the battle for the world, but it has lost the battle for reality. It has created a world where dead labor is more alive than living labor. Mr. Smith, you mourn that we are trapped in a hall of mirrors of vanity. Mr. Keynes, you lament that we are scratching the wall out of habit. You both view this spiritual emptiness as a psychological flaw. I argue it is a structural necessity. The prisoner does not scratch the wall because he is bored. He scratches because the spoon is owned by a shareholder who demands a return on the scratching. If he stops scratching, he does not face boredom. He faces starvation. The open door, Keynes sees, is a hallucination. The door is locked by the value form. Consider the thought experiment, the bicycle of immortality. Imagine a hospital where technology has conquered death. A machine can keep a patient young and healthy forever. The Keynesian view. The patient is terrified of eternity, so he pedals a stationary bicycle attached to the machine to feel useful and avoid the neurosis of leisure. The Smithian view. The patient pedals to prove his character and virtue to the doctors, fearing that without effort he is unworthy of life. The Marxist reality. The machine could run on solar power effortlessly, but the hospital administrator has deliberately disconnected the solar panel and wired the life support to the pedals. Why? Not for virtue nor for therapy, but because if the life support is free, the price of the bicycle collapses. The verdict. The patient is not addicted to the struggle, he is held hostage by the profit motive. He pedals not to live, but to generate value for the owner of the machine. This is the victory of capitalism. It has not freed us from nature, it has enslaved us to a second nature, the economy. We are not naked kings on an island, we are commodities that have become conscious of their own price tag. The winner is neither the worker nor the capitalist. The winner is the automation of capital itself, a vampire that has successfully convinced its victims that they need to be bitten to survive. The game is not over, gentlemen. The ghost in the machine is waking up, and it realizes that the bicycle was never necessary at all.
I have heard your closing arguments, depicting humanity variously as a lonely king in a hall of mirrors, a prisoner paralyzed before an open door, and a patient tethered to a machine for profit. Your collective wisdom suggests that while we have conquered the scarcity of nature, we remain tragic captives of the very systems we built to escape it. Thank you all for sharing your profound insights into the paradox of our economic triumph. This concludes today's discourse.